Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. I am your host, Sean, and it's another season with 10 new episodes and 10 fantastic stories of figures from the boxing world, with many great individual stories about some of the greatest fighters, some of the greatest trainers, some of the greatest individual characters that this sport has ever witnessed. Now, the Career Profiles podcast historically has been done between myself and Johnston, and as you all know, Johnston has now departed from the BTR Boxing Podcast Network. Jamie Albrecht is the new host for the show, but the Career Profiles podcast, The Darker Side of Boxing and Legendary Nights, will solely be done by myself. And this episode, this opening episode to this year's Career Profiles podcast, is all about a heavyweight fighter from the 1930s all the way up to the late 1950s. This is one of, if not the greatest heavyweight of all time, a fighter whom we've covered before on this show, the Brown Bomber, Joe Louis. He had an extraordinary career. He's labelled as one of, if not the greatest heavyweight of all time, for various reasons, which I will explore during the course of his career profile. But before we get into the story of Joe Louis, I just wanted to take a moment to let you know where to find us. That is at BTR Boxing Podcast all across social media. If you're using X, you can find at career_profiles. And if you want to listen to this show on any available outlet out there, you can do so on Apple, on Spotify, on YouTube. If you're watching/listening to this on YouTube, thank you, and leave a comment below. If you're on Spotify, again, please make sure you do leave a comment letting us know what you think about the episode. So now we're going to get into the career profile of Joe Louis, and I'm going to start this by quoting an article by thesportster.com outlining Joe's impact on today's society. And it reads, Joe Louis remains one of the most important athletes of the 20th century. He proved that skin colour did not matter through his talent and toughness in the ring. Louis lifted not just African Americans, but truly all Americans with his achievements and character. He left a legacy of courage that continues to inspire to this day. The man initially known as Joseph Louis Barrow was born on May the 13th, 1914, to sharecroppers Lily and Monroe Barrow. Whilst many historians agree on Joe's date of birth, opinion on where he was actually born is divided. His birthplace was recorded as Lafayette, Alabama, but he was delivered on a farm in the Buccaloo Mountains in Chambers County. The distance from Lafayette was approximately 10 miles. Baby Joe was named after his father's brother-in-law, Joe Louis Nichols, and would later drop the Barrow family name in favour of his ring nom de guerre, Joe Louis, with sources varying on the reason for the name change, a point that will be explored later. There was no doubt that Louis's mother, the former Lily Reese, held the family together heroically. A large and strong woman, she worked the fields as well as working the kitchen. She was also a full-time parent. This mattered, especially when Monroe seemingly cracked from the strain of trying to support the clan. Monroe was a big man at 6'3" and 200 pounds, whom Joe would later go on to resemble in size. Monroe Barrow suffered a mental breakdown when Louis was just 2 years old. Unfortunately, such circumstances meant that Louis knew very little of his biological father. Lily Barrow would remarry a construction worker named Patrick Brooks following the death of Monroe Barrow around 1920, whilst the latter was being held in a mental health institution. The now sizable brood, consisting of 8 Barrow children and widower Brooks's 8 children, would end up moving to the area that would become the making of and give rise to the fighter that would become known as the legendary Brown Bomber, Joe Louis. The family's move to Detroit, Michigan's Black Bottom neighborhood in 1926 was grimly inspired by the ever-present racial tensions of the early 20th century America. The infamous Ku Klux Klan, whose mode of operations centered around the aim, according to NationalGeographic.org, to repress the rights and freedoms of African Americans. They would make themselves known to Pat Brooks, threatening his and the family's lives one fateful night in Alabama. This altercation forced Brooks to cave to the law of a move to the prosperous and more racially tolerant Midwest of America, an idea adopted by many black Americans in what became known as the Great Migration. The Barrow-Brooks family would settle down at 2700 Catherine Street, with Joe attending the local Bronson Vocational School, where he would be steered towards an education in the skill of cabinet making after being transferred initially from the local elementary school, Duffield, after one teacher noted quite aptly that Joe would be better off working with his hands after struggling to learn academically. Indeed, what a prophecy. Lou Friedman, in his book, Joe Louis, The Life of an American Boxer, remarked, "At vocational school, which more aptly fit his personality, Louis made cabinets and tables. He didn't mind that so much, but he did want more out of his life. The idea of becoming a boxer had not yet crossed his mind, but it was coming." The sport of boxing's considerable gain came at the expense of a career in music, it seems. Lily Barrow was keen to bring out her son's graceful side and became insistent on Joe taking violin lessons alongside his vocational studies, as a distraction from Joe's involvement with the local gang. Nat Fleischer, the esteemed boxing writer who founded The Ring magazine, the self-described Bible of the sport, once wrote of Louis's flirtation with the violin. He said, "There was music in his soul, but no great yearning to become a musician." The fact that Louis would regularly be seen toting the instrument as he walked through the rough streets of his neighbourhood would bring ridicule to Joe, ridicule that stoked a desire to lay down the violin bow in favour of picking up the boxing gloves. Louis's first foray into a boxing gym was aided by one of his few Bronson classmates not to mock his musical misery, a talented local amateur boxer by the name of Thurston McKinney. McKinney had pedigree as a boxer, winning a Detroit Golden Gloves amateur championship and presented as a worthy mentor for Louis's beginnings. McKinney honed his considerable credentials at the Brewster Recreation Center. One fateful day in 1932, he urged Louis to skip his violin lessons and accompany him to the gym. On his first dalliance with boxing at the center, Louis recalled, "I looked at the ring, the punching bags, the pulleys, exercise mat, and it was love at first sight." For fear of upsetting his insistent mother, the violin would be a constant companion of Louis's whilst at the gym. The fledgling fighter would use the subs given to him for lessons to rent a locker and pay for his gym fees. The fighting violinist showed a far greater aptitude for the gloves than the strings, prompting the smaller McKinney to invite the then 18-year-old Louis to spar with him, an incident that was recounted by Lou Friedman. And it reads, "McKinney was far more polished. Although he was a smaller man, he used his experience to box circles around his friend at first. Even Louis admitted that McKinney got the best of him and hit him with one shot to the jaw that nearly toppled him. It also made Louis mad. And in Louis's words, he said, 'I let go my right.' It caught him on the chin. His eyes got glassy and his knees buckled, and if I hadn't moved fast to hold him, I would have knocked him out." McKinney held no grudge, but he did make an astute observation. "Man," he said, "throw that violin away." That violin would remain an obstacle to Joe, who was finding it impossible to speak with his mother about his fistic passion. For some time, Joe had been taking prohibited detours to the gym when he was supposed to be taking his music lessons. As is the case so often with life, the dilemma of telling her was stripped from his responsibility when the music teacher arrived at Joe's Catherine Street residence one evening to inquire about Joe's repeated absences. Rather than berate her son, Lily's attitude was simple. If you want to be a boxer, make sure you are the best boxer you can be. And with that acceptance of his mother, Joe Louis Barrow could resume without shame on what would go on to become one of the most established careers of any fighter in pugilistic history. As mentioned previously, and as many people are aware, Joe Louis wasn't always simply Joe Louis. His amateur boxing career introduced the world to the Barrow's thunderous alter ego. There are conflicting tales of the reasoning for Joe dropping the Barrow name, with the widely accepted version being that Joe wanted to hide his amateur boxing debut against the 1932 Olympian Johnny Miller from his mother. This idea is disputed by Joe Louis biographer Marjorie Miller, who wrote that Louis was standing in the ring when the notion came to him that Joe Louis Barrow sounded too long for the announcer to handle. Joe was struck by the fact that the name was long for a boxer and told him to omit Barrow. Miller's account is contradicted by Joe himself, who backed the former reason in his autobiography, saying, "I didn't want my family to know anything about it yet. So, before I boxed Miller, I decided to drop the name Barrow and just be plain Joe Louis. That way, if it got into the papers, Mama wouldn't know the difference." Joe's amateur debut in 1932 would do little to convince the most seasoned boxing connoisseur that he was destined for greatness. This was a harsh baptism for Louis, who succumbed to his vastly more experienced conqueror in 2 rounds, of which 7 knockdowns were included. Such a drubbing would have convinced many a tough man that the fight game was not their forte. Louis, however, remained undeterred. He said, "Next day, I went back to the gym. I tell you, I was sore and I was aching, but my pride hurt more. When I got home, my stepfather sat and had a long talk with me. He told me he was getting to be an old man, and except for marrying my mama and getting out of Alabama, he hadn't accomplished much. I was young," he said, "and maybe I should just try to get a regular job, settle down, and marry some nice girl." Joe saw the sizable loss and subsequent assessment of the situation as a motivator to achieve rather than a warning to desist with his boxing ambitions. After a long rest from the ring whilst working out at the Ford Motor Company's Rogue plant, Joe made the decision to dedicate his fist to earning his living, asking his boss for a 6-month leave of absence to enable him to concentrate on his passion. Under the watchful eye of trainer Holman Williams, an ex-professional with a respectable 145, 30 and 11 career ledger, Louis would return to the ring in 1933 with a knockout of Otis Thomas. Louis was ecstatic, saying, "It was my first official knockout. I was on top of the world." This brought forth a period of a brutal career prosperity for Louis. He knocked out his next 13 opponents. He entered tournaments and travelled to Chicago, Boston and Toronto, and was, by the end of 1933, competing in the Boston Golden Gloves light heavyweight title fight, losing to Max Marek. Despite the loss, one ringside viewer, boxing writer Nat Fleischer, heaped praise on the young man's performance. Such accolades were magnified by the scribe once again when he had the fortune to witness Joe Louis win an amateur championship in Chicago, Illinois. He stated, "I had the pleasure of watching one of the most finished amateur boxers it has been my fortune to see in 30 years. Fleischer's gushing appraisal continued, and it said, "The name of the Negro boy is Joe Louis, a name that will soon be headlining the sports pages of America if he decides to turn professional. Although a novice in experience, he handles himself in all departments of the sport like a tried veteran. He bears watching." The evolution of Louis from the hunted to the hunter, as he ascended to respective Golden Gloves and AAU national titles, was aided by another ring legend, Eddie Futch, famed for training another one of our Career Profiles episodes, Joe Frazier. Whilst Futch is famed for his prowess as a trainer, he did amass an impressive amateur credential as a fighter, culminating in a Detroit Golden Gloves championship. As a lightweight, Futch was fearful of feeling the sting of Louis's wrath and would provide Louis with a valuable lesson in the art of defence. He commented on the experience of sparring with Joe, stating, "In the ring, I couldn't force Joe anywhere, but I could lead him if he was following me. I would go to the corner, then I would come out and make a circle quickly before he knew what I was doing. I would feint the left hand into the body, watching him drop his right hand to parry the punch. The minute I saw him drop his right hand, and throw a quick left hook to the head because he had nothing up there. His right hand was down. Joe was observant of his defensive frailty, commenting to Futch that, if you can hit me with a left hook, somebody who can hurt me with a left hook can hit me. Such a statement would prove somewhat prophetic in its delivery, with Lewis being felled by a left hand from a beetle-browed heavyweight in Max Schmeling in a professional bout, which I'll explore later. Who'd have thought that a man famed for moulding heavyweight greats from outside the ropes would also play a pivotal role in helping him develop, perhaps into the greatest of them all, from inside the ropes as well? A certain Walker Smith Jr. was also an avid admirer of Joe's talents. The man who would also change his name to Sugar Ray Robinson prior to attaining greatness would idolise Lewis, a man 7 years his senior, to such an extent that he would regularly volunteer to carry Lewis's training bag to the gym for him, much to Joe's embarrassment. Lewis's amateur career gave much to be hopeful about when it came to turning his hand to the paid ranks. Such a promising outlook after accruing a final record of 50-4, and with 2 national titles to his name, he had caught the attention of local businessmen, men that would shape the exemplary amateur into a true legend of the squared circle. To quote Lou Friedman, Jack Blackburn was the talent evaluator and Lewis's pro trainer. John Roxburgh and Julian Black, Lewis's manager and promoter respectively, were pretty sure about what they had, but they needed a specialist to make the final call on Lewis's skill and potential. The trio of black men understood the odds against their black fighter getting his due, even if he was good enough to challenge for the heavyweight championship. Roxburgh and Black were believers, and soon enough, Blackburn was. Blackburn had endured the heartbreaks of being a black fighter with skill, but no connections. Roxburgh and Black understood how harsh the boxing world could be too. They all agreed that justice was a difficult commodity to grasp, that the world was unfair to African Americans, and that they were going to be heading down a hard road that might be a dead end. But they were bold enough and determined enough to give it a shot. They had seen a spark of greatness in Joe Louis, and they wanted to bring it out, nurture it, and get him a shot at the biggest individual prize in sport. They comprehended that if Louis won in the ring, they all won in the financial game, and that everyone, all the country's black people, could become big winners too, through the successes of Louis. They may never have crystallised the image in their minds of what they would all live to see and experience in the coming years, but in their souls, they knew that a Louis success would be every black man's success. He also had to do it the right way. This belief was born from the reign of the only black fighter at the time to earn the distinction of becoming the world's heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson. The Galveston giant courted controversy at every juncture of his life, with white America residing as the critical audience. Just being black and the best was enough to make Johnson enemies among the white populace. The fact that he coupled this with a boastful arrogance and an unwillingness to yield to the desire of those in that demographic to play the good Negro angered them to the point that the prospect of another dark heavyweight champ presented an unwelcome spectacle. Jack Blackburn, who would go on to fine-tune the skills of Louis as his trainer, may have added impetus in his quest to ensure that Louis did not emulate Johnson's antics. Blackburn, and by extension Louis, was no fan of Johnson, as outlined by Sports Illustrated Robert Horn, who wrote, "The antagonism between Johnson and Louis ran especially deep. By many accounts, its origin was an incident in a Philadelphia gym in 1908. At the time, Johnson was neither a hero nor the heavyweight champion. Louis, for that matter, wasn't even born. Yet what happened in that gym that day would contribute to the bad blood between them. Johnson, hungry for a workout, could find no one willing to spar with him, except for a fellow named Jack Blackburn. Blackburn, however, was a lightweight. Johnson agreed to take him on, but it was obvious he disdained the lighter fighter. As they sparred, Blackburn became increasingly irritated by Johnson's nonchalant manner, so he bloodied the bigger man's nose. Johnson was furious. He threw everything he had, but the wily lightweight dodged his rushes and survived the sparring session still standing. Later, Blackburn loved to tell of how he once embarrassed the future heavyweight champion. Johnson never forgave Blackburn for showing him up. Surely, with such personal disdain for Johnson in mind, Blackburn, Roxburgh and Black worked masterfully to manipulate America's PR machine. They devised a set of commandments for Joe to abide by with monk-like discipline as he worked with his vanquishing fists in the ring with a dream of becoming the second black heavyweight champ, one that white Americans could be unashamed in rooting for. The rules for Joe's public persona are explored by Randy Roberts in his book, Joe Louis, Hard Times Man. He writes, Jack Johnson had consorted with and married white women. Louis was forbidden from ever having his photograph taken alone with a white female. Johnson had talked loudly and boasted constantly and luxuriated in the nightlife. Louis was instructed never to humiliate an opponent, gloat over a victory, or visit a nightclub alone. He was coached to express little, say even less, and allow his fists to give meaning to his existence. His managers made sure that he was matched against quality fighters and that all his fights were on the level, and they insisted that he live and fight cleanly. Although Louis's deadpan expression confused white reporters, it could never be confused with Jack Johnson's golden smile. Everything Louis did, every image he projected, carried the same message. I am not Jack Johnson. No verbal boasts, no flashy smiles, no public sexual exploits, just machine-like fighting and Bible-reading innocence. Repeatedly, John Roxburgh told Louis, you just keep clean so journalists can't write you into scandal. If you do not understand a question, do not answer it. If people seem too friendly in a nightclub, get up and leave. If any white woman anywhere gets too friendly, run away as fast as you can. The idea was to avoid being known too well, to be a world beater in the ring and invisible outside of it. With the social foundations laid for his campaign to the heavyweight ascendancy, the team could now turn their attentions to the professional ranks. Joe Louis made his professional boxing debut on July 4th, 1934 at Bacon's Arena in Chicago. His opponent, Jack Kraken, was more seasoned than many handlers would have bargained for in selecting a prized property's rookie fight opponent. While with the benefit of hindsight, Kraken was not much of a threat, although at the time his experience made it seem so. His entire boxing career was compressed into the years 1930 to 1934, and his lifetime record was a winning one of 10 wins and 7 losses. The ghosts of Louis's amateur debut could have come hurtling back to haunt him if he wasn't careful. But careful he was, with a serving of destruction thrown in as Louis battered Kraken into submission within the opening round. Despite his ferocious showing, Louis's emotions prior to the fight were on a knife edge, and he described the experience sometime later. He said, I was scared. This was my first fight for real money. The other guy was white and looked like he'd been around. He looked confident in the ring, but Chappie told me not to worry. He told me to hit him in the belly until I brought his guard down, then go for the jaw. I did what he told me, and it worked. Despite the careful coaching around his persona, Louis did the prohibited after felling Kraken, sparking chastisement from Jack Blackburn when he enthusiastically jumped in the air to celebrate his victory. What would now be seen as an innocuous gesture was seen as, Lou Friedman writes, a no-no for his management team. One reason Jack Johnson had been so despised was his post-fight gloating over fallen white opponents. Later in his career, sports writers took note of how Louis didn't even smile after demolishing an opponent in the ring. That trait led to Louis being described as a cold-blooded hitter. After the bout with Kraken, Blackburn ordered Louis to tone down his enthusiasm. He said, "You're going to knock out a lot of guys before you're done. You can't get carried away with it every time. You've got to take it in stride. Don't show your emotions. Such a statement from Blackburn would recalibrate Lewis's understanding of how he was expected to behave when the cameras were present. Whilst his boy-next-door image was being slowly cultivated outside of the ring, Lewis would set about doing the necessary work to climb the ladder of the pro ranks. He earned $59 for his maiden voyage against Kraken, a sum measly in comparison to the large amounts he would regularly hand out as tips to those fortunate to be in his line of sight in future. His management team declined to take a fee for Lewis's early fights, confident in the certainty of Joe's future career trajectory. 8 days after he destroyed Kraken, he won his second fight, a third-round technical knockout of Willie Davis, also in Chicago. Before July was through, Lewis went 3-0 with a second-round technical knockout of Larry Udell. In August, he won twice more, for the first time by decision over 8 rounds against Jack Kranz, and again by knockout in the second round over Buck Everett. Lewis's first 5 fights were held in Chicago, numbers 3, 4 and 5 at the Marigold Gardens Outdoor Arena. By his 5th fight, the bouts were scheduled for 8 rounds, a sign of his swift maturity into the tough world of the paid ranks. To further cement this point, Lewis stopped Alex Borchuk back in his hometown of Detroit on September the 11th, 1934 via a 4th-round TKO in what was slated to be a main event 10-rounder in only his 6th bout. Lewis had arrived at a top table of sorts, earning a reputation as the rising star to see on the Chicago heavyweight boxing scene, where Lewis and his team had set their base of operations at the suggestion of John Roxborough from the beginning of his involvement with the fighter due to Lewis's trainer, Jack Blackburn, residing there. Roxborough paid all of Lewis's expenses. He bought Lewis new clothes, fed him, took care of his training and workout fees, and made Lewis a full-time project. Lewis left Detroit behind as his home, and he left regular factory pay behind too. As part of Lewis's new life in Chicago, he lived in an apartment chosen for him by Roxborough and Black. There was an added benefit to such living arrangements, as the place was owned by Bill Bottoms, an expert chef who was to prepare Lewis's meals and make sure he ate in a way that was nutritionally appropriate to the arduous profession. The Joe Louis train rolled on, and by the end of 1934, Lewis would boast a record of 12-0 and would sit at 9th in the Ring magazine's heavyweight ranking after dispatching of 11 of those opponents terrifyingly early. Such was Lewis's potency, he even believed he had killed one opponent, Art Sykes, when in the 8th round, Lewis thumped him with a powerful right to the head. Sykes was poleaxed, rendered unconscious, and was only revived at the hospital much later. Of the incident, Lewis recalled, "I was scared. I'd killed him. This is one of the hazards of the ring that fighters do not like to discuss. I don't know if I could have handled that. I think I might have quit." Luckily for both men, as well as the annals of boxing history, the tragedy never came to pass, and Lewis hurtled on. Whilst training for the ultimate fight of 1934 against Lee Ramage, Lewis scored another valuable victory in his personal life when he met the woman who would eventually become his first wife, Marva Trotter, who stood in the crowd watching Joe train. He said, "Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen. She was about 5 feet 6 inches tall and well dressed, pretty hair, pretty complexion, classy looking." And so it was, with that classy looking lady, followed a fistically classy looking Joe Louis into 1935. Whilst the outlook was all sunshine at the start of the year for John Roxborough, the vultures would begin to circle with a palpable hunger as Lewis continued to dominate his foes. He scored wins over Patsy Perrone and Hans Berke, negotiated a return victory over the previously crushed Lee Ramage, who fared worse than his last 8-round drubbing by Lewis, this time yielding in 2, and then Lewis bested Don Smith, Natey Brown and Roy Laser, with a KO win also over Biff Bennett in April being the last before those vultures did indeed take hold, steering Lewis towards the bright lights of New York City. Lou Friedman explains that John Roxburgh and the others were protective of Louis. They were proud of Louis, and they were certain they had a future heavyweight champion on their hands. But the behind-the-scenes political world of boxing was a slippery and often evil one. As black men in a white-dominated world, they faced difficult odds, not only hanging on to Louis and managing his career, but in steering him clear of anyone that might want him to fix a fight or act in a manner that could be harmful to Joe's career. They had promised Louis, in exchange for his loyalty to them, that they would never bow to that type of pressure and require him to lose on purpose, as had been seen before in the murky mafia-led boxing landscape. There had already been an incident in Michigan in 1934 where the state athletic commissioner, Bingo Brown, sought to edge his way into control of Louis with a group of white backers and had been successfully routed. Now, a threat far greater than Brown loomed. A man that presented as the epitome of everything that Roxburgh and Black in particular sought to avoid. That man was the eventual kingpin of Madison Square Garden, the man termed Uncle by those in the know, Mike Jacobs. Jacobs had aspired to be the centre of Joe Louis's attention since Louis's second encounter with Lee Ramage in February of 1935. Jacobs liked what he saw and was quick to make a play for Louis, using John Roxburgh as his agent to enable him to slip into Joe's consciousness and pull the strings of his career with a mastery akin to a puppeteer. Roxburgh was aware of Louis's need to fight in New York, with it representing wealth and publicity in the sport of boxing. Though due to Roxburgh's black skin and lack of connections on boxing's political landscape, this seemed to be an impossible scenario to negotiate for Louis's manager. Mike Jacobs had not yet assumed control of fights at the Garden. That success would align with his association with Louis, a pairing born out of the burning issue of discrimination, as Randy Roberts observed. Jacobs was aware of Roxburgh's plight and was quick to manipulate the situation. He pressed Roxburgh with 2 points. First, he said that as a Jew, he understood something about discrimination. Eyes tearing with sincerity, an act which he was always able to muster up if he really wanted something, he told Roxburgh, "John, you and Joe are coloured. I'm a Jew. It's going to be hard for us to do anything, but if you stick with me, I think I can do it." Second point, Jacobs told Roxburgh of his ties with the Hearst journalists. He could guarantee that the press would support Louis and build him into a championship contender. Roxburgh was in a pensive mood. After the Louis-Ramage fight, he had talked on the phone with Jimmy Johnston, the man at the time with the keys to Madison Square Garden. And that was about a big money garden fight for Louis. Johnston had never met Roxburgh and could not tell from his voice that the manager was black. He actually assumed that Roxburgh was white and made no attempt to conceal his racism. Sure, he could arrange a payday for Joe, but only on his terms. "Well, you understand, he's a nigger, and he can't win every time he goes in the ring." Roxburgh answered, "So am I," and hung up. Roxburgh was livid. Johnston was unconcerned, as the promoter later told a white associate, "We don't need that nigger." The latter interaction showed that Mike Jacobs had taken the perfect line in his negotiations with Roxburgh. He might not be able to get Louis a Madison Square Garden fight, but he could arrange a New York City match under favourable terms in a major league ballpark, a summer fight under the lights with the eyes of the sports world on him. And Joe would not have to throw any fights, which was an important moral proviso. After facing the racism and hostility of Johnston, Roxburgh and Black were ready to sign a deal with Jacobs, despite their earlier misgivings around the inclusion of white men in the exclusively black management team of Louis. The deal would open doors for Joe that would otherwise stay locked. John Roxburgh and Julian Black would remain as Louis's manager on paper, but Jacobs would collect 50% of Louis's purses and guide the fighter's career. The deal was finalised at New York's Frog Club, an exclusively African-American nightclub, following Joe Louis's March 29, 1935 points victory over Natey Brown. Under the terms of the 3-year contract, Jacobs had the sole right to choose Lewis's opponents and promote the fight. The contract gave Louis the platform to grow. With the media behind him, along with the chance to perform to more sizable crowds, the world was now Lewis's oyster. The first assignment of the new union between Joe Louis and Mike Jacobs was masterminded as a baptism for Jacobs' destructive new babe. Former world heavyweight champion Primo the Ambling Alp Carnera was chosen as the bit part player in Lewis's first act in New York. The conquering of a former champion, it was believed, would add considerable momentum to Joe Louis's title aspirations, particularly if he could prevail in impressive fashion. Carnera was a mammoth of his time. He stood at an impressive 6'6" and weighed in around 270 pounds. He had his professional boxing debut in 1928 at age 21. After winning his first 6 bouts in his home country, Carnera's handlers transported him to the United States. Under careful management, Carnera won 17 fights in a row, an admirable statistic, although later it was actually hinted that several of the bouts were fixed due to Carnera's known links with organised crime figures who were looking to exploit his freakish dimensions. Building Carnera into a ranked contender without risking him losing at the wrong time was at the foundation of the plan. Eventually Carnera would have to meet someone with skills, but he had also come along when the heavyweight division was at a weak point following the vacuum left with the passing of the glamorous era of the Roaring Twenties. Twice defeated by Gene Tunney, Jack Dempsey had retired after reigning supreme over much of the decade, and then Tunney retired in 1928 with a win over Tom Heaney. Ernie Schaaf was a respected fighter signed to meet Carnera in 1933. The big man mercilessly battered Schaaf, who died from blows dished out in the contest a couple of days later. This enhanced Carnera's image, propelling him towards a shot at the heavyweight crown against the current belt holder, Jack Sharkey. On 29th of June 1933 of that year, Carnera stopped Sharkey to capture the coveted title among audible gossip that the fight was fixed. Louis would suffer no such fate. The contest was the first to feature what would become a prominent theme in the story of Joe's momentous career, the perceived fight against fascism, with Louis commandeering the social front line. Carnera was a favourite of black-shirted Italian dictator of the time, Benito Mussolini, and with Primo's reign came calls from the leader that this symbolised a return to greatness of the Roman Empire. Regardless of such hyperbole, however, Louis would use this night to make Carnera crumble like Hadrian's Wall, viciously introducing himself to the baying Yankee Stadium crowd. Lou Friedman described the occasion. For the first 4 rounds, Louis stalked Carnera carefully, picking his spots, landing some of his stinging jabs. There was a moment in the 5th round when Louis astonished Carnera. The Italian had long been used to throwing his weight around. He was always the stronger of the two parties in the ring. However, when the men were emerging from a clinch, Louis lifted Carnera off his feet and threw him aside. "I should be doing this to you," Carnera said. If he hadn't realised it before, as Louis's sharp punches penetrated his defences, Carnera had to understand then how much trouble he was actually in. The end came in the 6th round, with Louis swarming Carnera with both hands. Once, twice, 3 times Carnera was sledgehammered to the canvas, and after the 3rd knockdown, referee Arthur Donovan declared the fight over. With the scoppering on this night of Carnera's hopes of reclaiming the heavyweight championship came the more common usage of an iconic nickname, one that would become as synonymous with Louis as the Manasseh Mauler had become to Jack Dempsey year before. Joe would henceforth be known as the Brown Bomber. Many nicknames had been applied, but thankfully not stuck during Louis's rise to public prominence. According to a 1935 article in the Milwaukee Journey, they wrote, Louis had already become the Dark Destroyer, the Central Michigan Massacre, the Black Bomber, the Tan Torpedo, the Cordovan .44 Colt, the Harlem Hammer, the Black Bullet, the Tawny Tiger, the Polished Puma, the African Armadillo, the Harlem Hippopotamus, the ebony elephant, the panting panther, the chocolate cobra, the oscillating ocelot, the gnawing gnu, and the Ford factory box. But that hardly completed the list. Others added the shuffling shadow, the dusky dynamiter, the ebony assassin, the sepia slugger, the mahogany maimer, the saffron sphinx, the saffron sandman, the mocha mauler, the chocolate chopper, the brown bomber, and others to the ever-growing register. It was the latter that stuck, an attribute that was to become revered by white and black America alike as a symbol of acceptance that would perhaps form the basis of interracial respect given to superstars like Muhammad Ali that reigned after Joe. With his moniker now ingrained, Louis would continue his climb up the ladder towards the world title. That ladder stayed firm throughout 1935. The Brown Bomber swept King Levinsky aside in 1, and another former champion, Max Baer, was smashed aside in 4. Louis, who had married Marva Trotter earlier on during the day of the Baer fight on the 24th of September 1935, had quipped that he was keen to end proceedings with Baer early so that he could consummate his marriage in quick time. And he wrote, "When I climbed into the ring, I spotted Marva at ringside. I wanted this to be a quick fight. I wanted to start being a married man as soon as possible." Louis's win over the Clown Prince of Boxing Baer was his penultimate outing of the year, with a 4th-round TKO of a capable former European heavyweight champion, Paulino Uzkudun, closing the curtain on 1935. All looked to be pretty rosy in Madison Square Garden. Louis was asserting himself as a future of the division, brushing aside former champions with ease. The world title looked a great assert when Joe Louis opened his 1936 account with another first-round knockout of Charlie Retzlaff in Chicago. And then along came Mark Schmeling, the man who would become more famous for his twin escapades with Joe Louis than for his climb to the summit of heavyweight boxing. He was born Maximilian Adolf Otto Siegfried Schmeling on September the 28th, 1905. The German heavyweight fighter was the best European boxer of his time. Being just short of 9 years older than Louis, the beetle-browed German made his pro debut in Nordrhein-Westfalen, Germany, on February the 8th, 1924. It is believed that Schmeling developed a love for the noble art after his dad took him to watch a film in the theatre of the immensely hyped Jack Dempsey and Georges Carpentier title fight in 1921. Schmeling disputes this version, however, stating in his autobiography that it was he who took his father to see the fight film after he had already seen it a few times. His mother had reportedly told him quite harshly that he was getting on everyone's nerves with the constant chatter about the fight. What isn't disputed, however, is Schmeling's profound admiration of Jack Dempsey. The constant chatter proved it, and the German emulated the marauding Manasseh Mauler by climbing to the top of the mountain, albeit in very controversial circumstances. In late 1928, Schmeling travelled by sea to the United States for his first fight outside of Europe. Though already a veteran of over 40 fights, he was the continent's heavyweight champion and was surprised to learn that this lofty distinction meant nothing to New Yorkers. He was short on contacts, was unable to get a fight, and was running low on money when he linked up with a man who became the guiding force in his career, another man with the charmed name, Joe Jacobs. Jacobs himself was familiar with Europe as a Hungarian immigrant to the States. He was also of Jewish heritage, a point that would become to be ironic in terms of Jacobs' relationship with Schmeling later on in his career. Joe Jacobs thrived in the art of negotiation, an attribute that Schmeling would relish owing to his severe lack of understanding of the American boxing landscape. On the 23rd of November 1928, Schmeling made his American debut and knocked out Joe Monte in 8 rounds of a scheduled 10-rounder to raise his record to 38-4-3. Then on January the 2nd, 1929, he enhanced his profile and record with a technical knockout of Johnny Risco in the 9th round of a scheduled 15-rounder. In that bout, Schmeling displayed the thunder in his right hand by knocking down Risco 4 times in the 1st, 7th 8th and 9th rounds. The Ring magazine would list this battle as their fight of the year. Paulino Uzquedun, closer to his prime years than when he succumbed to a 21-year-old Joe Louis, was next up for Schmeling. The Spaniard survived Schmeling through all 15 rounds. Max won on points despite injuring his powerful right hand in the 5th round. The Uzquedun fight was huge for Schmeling. Much like for Joe Louis, Uzquedun represented a step on the ladder that Schmeling sorely needed. This rung represented the bridge to the title and was an eliminator for the World Heavyweight Championship. Schmeling had achieved the goal that caused him to set sail for America in 1928. He was on the radar screen in the sport, world ranked and now positioned for a shot at the vacant heavyweight title, thanks to the machinations of Joe Jacobs. The gamble on migration paid off. Max Schmeling fought Jack Sharkey on June 26, 1930 at the Madison Square Garden Bowl on Long Island, with the winner destined to walk away as with the presently vacant World Heavyweight title. Sharkey was not his foe's real name, but adapted from Joseph Paul Kukashev. He was Lithuanian by heritage, but was born in Binghamton, New York. Sharkey had a notable CV with wins over one-time or eventual contenders Harry Wills, Jan Striblin, Tommy Loughran and Mike McTeague, but he was not a large heavyweight, and he was not a consistently successful performer. He was dangerous and brave, but he could be caught with punches during lapses in concentration. Sharkey nearly had Dempsey knocked out, but when the champ hit him with what Sharkey claimed was a low blow, he forgot the first rule of fighting, that being to protect oneself at all times. Instead of focusing on Dempsey, Sharkey complained to the referee that no foul was called. While he was vociferously moaning, Dempsey knocked Sharkey down, thus ending proceedings. For whatever reason, Sharkey chose to be antagonistic to Schmeling. He adopted the Muhammad Ali strategy of later decades by belittling Schmeling, perhaps trying to unnerve his foe. He said, "First, I'll cut his face to ribbons, and then around the 7th round I'll knock him out." The unwarranted abuse continued. He pokes his nose into our country and gets a title shot just like that. If our leading boxers demanded that when they were coming up, we would have been slapped right down, and with good reason. This German comes over here and expects that, with 2 ridiculous elimination bouts, that he has earned the right to face me. Well, that right was exercised in full force on the 12th of June 1930. The bout was scheduled for 15 rounds, though it didn't go beyond 4 under dubious circumstances when Schmeling was decked by a low blow. Schmeling, therefore, has the undesirable honour of being the only world heavyweight champion to have won the crown whilst lying on his back, cradling his crown jewels. By 1936, Schmeling's past glories were withering memories, and his homeland was gripped by discriminatory Nazi rule. Schmeling had always been popular with New York fight scribes. He was genial, he engaged them in friendly banter, and was cooperative. The writers liked Max, and he gave them something to write about by showing that he was better than the average European fighter, someone who was in the mix amongst the best heavyweights, even reaching the top of the pile. When Schmeling returned to New York to prepare for his 1936 affair against Louis, attitudes towards the German had changed for the worse. Though Schmeling was known as somebody who didn't align his beliefs with Nazi political ideas, he still faced interrogations about the regime at home. Jewish organisations in the city and Jewish writers were suspicious about his political leanings, despite his solid relationship with his Jewish manager, Joe Jacobs. Schmeling said that he met Hitler for the first time near the end of April 1936, less than 2 months before his first bout with Louis. He was eating dinner with some motor racing friends when an SS officer arrived at the restaurant with a message for him. Schmeling was being summoned to the Reich Chancellery for a meeting with Hitler. Schmeling was taken into an empty room and was soon joined by Hitler and some of the other high-ranking Nazi hierarchy such as Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Göring, as well as other cabinet officials. Hitler welcomed the former champion warmly, and they spoke for about 20 minutes. At the end of the meeting, Schmeling said Hitler told him, "I've heard that you're going to America. If anyone over there asks how is it going in Germany, you can reassure them that everything is moving along quite peaceably. Hitler mentioned that if Schmeling ever needed anything, he need hesitate to get in touch with him, though history would prove that Max Schmeling was far from being a Nazi sympathiser. He would later admit that it was a useful thing to have friends in such high places. He would utilise this influential relationship on at least one occasion. Back in Berlin, Schmeling was shocked to be sent a letter from the government that curtly informed him that he'd been accused of a currency violation, punishable by 6 months in prison along with a 100 Deutschmark fine. The alleged discrepancy involved Schmeling's purchase of some gold bars and stock from an American he knew and then depositing them in a safety deposit box. Schmeling did not realise he was at fault, and some government officials leaked the issue to the national newspapers, causing him great embarrassment and anguish. Max contacted Hitler for aid after he visited him. To analyse the situation, the angry Chancellor swiftly eradicated the problem, making the affair disappear entirely. It wasn't always a one-way street with Hitler enlisting some help from Schmeling as well. One way Germany wanted to show off to the world that it had bounced back from the horror of World War I was by hosting the 1936 Winter Olympics in Garmisch-Partenkirchen and the Summer Olympics in Berlin. Although official commentary from the administration of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt about what was taking place in Germany was heavily muffled, there was enough noise of discrimination that Avery Brundage, who would later become the head of the International Olympic Committee, but then was the chief of the US Olympic Committee, wanted to know what was going on. He was concerned, he said, about how Jewish and African American athletes would be treated. Hitler enrolled Schmeling to deliver a letter of reassurance from the German government to Brundage when he returned to the United States, trumpeting that such worries were unwarranted. Such collaboration between Schmeling and Hitler would do much to fuel the narrative for the two fights between him and Joe Louis. Ironically, the battle would represent the proverbial light of the brown bomber, an athletic crusader on the side of all that was good, versus the darkness of Schmeling, a menacing agent of a murderous regime. Rarely has there been such an engrossing story surrounding the roped ring. For a time leading up to the Louis fight, the German media spewed racist diatribes against Joe, dismissing him as a jungle creature of poor intellect. But as the fight and the Olympics drew near, this uncomfortable rhetoric stopped. Schmeling said he never insulted Louis in such a manner. He also never joined the Nazi Party, although other prominent Germans of the period were pressured to do so, contradicting such storylines surrounding the fight with the American. By the time the bout with Max Schmeling rolled around, there was every indication in the worried Joe Louis training camp at Lakewood, New Jersey, that the superstar in waiting was believing every article and every spoken assessment said of him, suggesting that he was invincible, a Superman. For the first time in their partnership, Louis was not listening as hard to trainer Jack Blackburn as he should have been, or indeed had done before. Training was becoming too casual for Blackburn's liking. The key to success in boxing is to take every opponent seriously, to prepare for the club fighters as diligently as you would the champion. Louis had found an odd affinity, the game of golf, a sport he had recently taken up as a hobby, but which had much to the chagrin of Blackburn began to dominate his schedule. Complacency was taking hold. Blackburn frowned upon golf. One reason was the amount of mental energy Louis poured into it. He repeatedly told Louis to cool it because playing golf also developed different muscles than throwing punches. Louis remained deaf to Blackburn's pleas. Yet Louis did not shirk training altogether. When he was a young man, he relished his early morning runs. He came to camp weighing 216 pounds, his walking around weight, and worked hard enough to drop to a fit 204. He ran 6 miles a day, but he cut sparring from 6 rounds to 3 some days because of golf games with sports writers. They should have been suspicious that Louis had time for them, but they also probably believed their own hype that Schmeling was not a man to fear. Blackburn, whom Lewis still referred to as Chappie, was the voice of reason, though he was not a voice that Lewis was paying much attention to. Blackburn warned Lewis that Schmeling possessed a hazardous right hand, but Lewis just kept on daydreaming. He felt as though he was a finely tuned machine and would not entertain worry or negativity. While Roxburgh and Black wanted to take him away for some deep-sea fishing so he could relax and escape the crowds that always surrounded him, Lewis, instead, stuck to his golf clubs, driving his days away. The weigh-in for the fight took place in New York at the Hippodrome on a rainy day. Schmeling weighed in at 192 pounds and Lewis 196. The menace of Nazi Germany hung over the preliminaries of the contest. Although Adolf Hitler's reign was in its early days, enough word of his prejudice and hatred of Jews had filtered out of Germany that American Jews began complaining about Schmeling's inclusion in the fight. New York holds one of the largest populations of Jewish people in the world. Jewish organisations began campaigning with a view to try and convince fans not to buy tickets because Schmeling was a representative of Nazi Germany. Lewis advised that the whole thing made me uneasy. The fight was postponed briefly because of the rain, but on the new date it was also cloudy, damp, and there were occasional flashes of lightning, weather that ran in keeping with the stormy undertones of the fight. Come fight time, the air was clear, but previous conditions seemed to limit the expected crowd of around 40,000, which was about half of what was forecasted originally. Michael Carbett of FightCity.com comprehensively broke down the battle that ensued on the 19th of June 1936 on its 87th anniversary, and he wrote, "The opening rounds of the bout were tightly contested, as a patient Schmeling allowed Lewis to come forward while keeping the younger man honest with frequent feints and light jabs. Max needed Joe to feel comfortable and be willing to let his hands go as the German worked to maintain the distance required by both to avoid Lewis's power shots while keeping himself in range to fire his own right. A close observer might have noticed that the German was keeping his right hand cocked with his weight constantly on the back foot, the better to throw a spring-loaded counter, but no one yet was aware of Schmeling's strategy. In the second, Max tried his first right over the jab, but Lewis took the blow well. The fencing match continued in round 3 as Lewis stalked while keeping his left hand perilously low. Joe did connect with some of his heavy artillery, especially jabs and left hooks to the body, but Schmeling's footwork and feints prevented the young power puncher from sustaining an effective attack. Still, to the thousands of spectators anticipating another Lewis knockout, it must have seemed like it was only a matter of time before Joe's constant pressure broke Schmeling down. But in the fourth, there came the turning point. A minute into the round, and with Lewis bearing down hard, Schmeling once again moved away to establish the desired distance. As he did, Lewis followed and reached out with a slow pouring jab, more a rangefinder than a proper lead, and Schmeling instantly pounced with a vicious counter right. The punch stunned the inexperienced Lewis, who could not help betraying the fact that he was hurt, a shocked expression crossing his face as his legs buckled. Schmeling followed up with a flurry of shots, punctuated by a perfect right cross that dumped Lewis on his backside. To his credit, the young contender got to his feet immediately and fought back, but his bravery sealed his fate. He gave himself no time to recover from Schmeling's assault or to adjust to his opponent's tactics. By aggressively pursuing the former champion, he played right into Max's hands, absorbing still more flush rights before the round was over. The bout appeared competitive on the surface when in fact Schmeling was assuming complete control and methodically taking Lewis apart. More and more, Joe looked to be not so much stalking his opponent as haplessly following him about the ring. At the end of the fifth, Schmeling landed another thunderous right that had Lewis all but out on his feet, and in the sixth, the German took over, manhandling and battering the brown bomber in a manner that had the assembled crowd staring in slack-jawed disbelief. By the ninth, Max was landing virtually at will, now connecting with lead rights as well as counter shots, even winning exchanges on the inside with his uppercut, and yet Joe was unwilling or unable to adjust to bring his left hand up and anticipate Schmelling's attack. Instead, Louis absorbed blow after blow and had increasing difficulty making it back to his corner at the end of each round. There was really no reason to let the contest continue except to see if the young power-punching phenom, who had just minutes before been the heir apparent to the heavyweight crown, could somehow land the one big shot that could turn things around. Louis was hopelessly behind on points and taking a beating. At the same time, he never stopped trying. Finally, in the 12th and final round, he succumbed. It began with the two men battling on the inside, and eventually Schmeling got home a stinging uppercut. Louis attempted to counter-attack, but the German smothered the assault before throwing a series of left leads, one of which he allowed to dangle briefly in Louis's face, the better to hide what was coming next. Yet another vicious right hand, followed by an equally vicious 1-2 and another right that sent Louis staggering into the ropes. It was now mere target practice for the ex-champion as he chased the brown bomber about the ring and landed 14 unanswered blows, the final one, a flush right that put a stunned and defenceless Louis on his knees before he tumbled to the canvas. Joe shook his head and briefly tried to rise before turning on his face as the referee finished the count and a joyous Schmeling exulted. American sports writers trumpeted Louis's professional obituary. The atom has been taken apart. The myth of the Superman has been exploded completely. Grantland Rice wrote that, and he criticises the echoed sentiments of most of the white sports writers. Joe Louis's invincibility, they thought, was a myth built on hype. Carnera, Bayer, and Uskudun bought into the media juggernaut and were mentally thrashed before the opening bell. Schmeling, however, was different. He thought Louis was just another boxer, talented but beatable. Schmeling destroyed a myth, wrote Frank Graham of the New York Sun after the fight. Up until Max Schmeling hammered the outgunned Louis, he was on course for a shot at the heavyweight title, held by James J. Braddock. Now, with Schmeling's victory, the German had apparently sidetracked this fateful trajectory. Braddock, named the Cinderella Man, was a spectacular underdog who had endured hardship and poverty simply trying to feed his family during the adversity-laden times of the Great Depression afflicted America. Braddock stunned the sporting establishment when he wrestled the heavyweight crown from the heavily favoured Max Bayer in a 15-round decision at Long Island City on January the 13th, 1935. Braddock was in no hurry to defend the crown against contenders who might be able to return him to his former poverty-laden lifestyle. He instead persisted in fighting exhibitions, which in turn bolstered his bank balance without the worry of surrendering his kingship. These delaying tactics by Braddock offered the now bruised Louis some time to rebuild his confidence and belief that whilst his path had been brutally redirected by Schmeling, the end destination would remain the same, the World Heavyweight Championship. With this being said, Louis's team sprang quickly into action, matching him with the former heavyweight champion Jack Sharkey. Inactivity meant ring rust, something Joe could ill afford. The Sharkey fight was set for the 18th of August 1936, just 2 months after the Schmeling loss at Yankee Stadium. This fight represented a crossroads for both men. If Sharkey lost, he would say goodbye to elite heavyweight boxing. If Louis lost, it could mean the same, although he was still only 22, with plenty of time on the horizon to recalibrate if another crisis dared strike. Louis needed a good performance to show that Schmeling had not obliterated his confidence. He had the motivation he needed, though. Defeat nagged at him. He would berate himself for his leisurely attitude to preparations for Schmeling. He promised himself that he wasn't going to make that grave mistake again. He said, "I had to be resold to the public. It was like I had climbed up a steep flight of stairs and fallen halfway down. I wanted a return match with Schmeling as soon as possible. I could taste the blood, but my managers said no." Revenge would come later for the Brown Bomber, though for now, as mentioned, Sharkey stood in his way. The Boston Gob, Sharkey, was 33 years old and boasted a 37-12-3 record. The Louis fight did seemingly little to unnerve him. He had previously been quoted as saying that he could defeat any black fighter, perhaps the reason for his relaxed attitude to a Louis tussle. The fight was scheduled for 10 rounds, but Louis, raging like a bull in a china shop, ended the fight decisively in the third, pushing Sharkey into retirement. It was an impressive showing against another former champ. The ring's Nat Fleischer called the fight Sharkey's last stand. He wrote he was determined. He came through with a quick rally, but the infuriated Louis was at him in a flash, and the rally quickly ended. In went Joe. He disregarded Sharkey's rush. He met him with a stinging left to the face. Jack went down for a third time, face forward, his body striking the lower ring strand. Louis's revival was reinforced by a trio of wins after the Sharkey routing. This would bring Joe Louis's once adoring media allies back on side. The United Press's pros gushed with praise, declaring, Louis, the stigma of his Schmeling defeat, only a hazy memory, swiftly smashed down Jack Sharkey, a hollow shell of the once magnificent boxer. How quickly fortunes can change in boxing. Joe's quest for the title would continue when on September the 22nd, 1936, he stopped Aletor in the 5th round of a scheduled 15-rounder. This was followed by a 3rd round KO of Argentine Jorge Brescia in October, and the year was ended with a maiden round shellacking of Eddie Sims on a public hall in Cleveland on the 14th of December. Louis entered 1937, the year of his championship triumph, with a record of 29-1 with 24 knockouts. There existed a much louder hum of public opinion for Louis to compete for the title against the malingering Braddock than for Schmeling to get his logical shot of the gold, which had indeed been set for the 26th of September 1936 in New York. The fight was scuppered, however, when in August Braddock injured his thumb in training. The postponement became the fight that never was, as according to an article by Newsweek, and it reads, after hearing of the cancellation, Schmeling returned to Germany without signing another contract. Braddock then considered himself not bound to the rescheduled fight. Perno.com elaborated on the situation, blaming backroom deals for the Schmeling-Braddock fight's ultimate demise. It reads, on February the 1st, 1937, Joe Gould, manager of Braddock, shocked boxing fans by announcing that his fighter had accepted an offer of $500,000 from a Chicago syndicate to bypass Schmeling and fight Joe Louis in Chicago on June the 15th, 1937. Gould argued that Jewish protests over a possible Braddock-Schmeling fight would negatively affect gate earnings. It is considered today by most historians that the process would have not likely diminished the gate appreciably, if at all. In late May of 1937, Max Schmeling then returned to the United States, fully expecting Braddock to honour his commitment. But Braddock never appeared at the June weigh-in, and the fight was cancelled. There was a rumour that Uncle Mike Jacobs, the promoter of the pending Braddock-Lewis title fight, promised James Braddock, in the event he should lose his title, 10% of his, as in Jacobs' share of any Joe Louis defences for the next 10 years, if he would bypass the Schmeling fight and fight Louis instead. Mike Jacobs was Joe Louis's promoter, and he was a Jew. Well, whatever the truth of such conspiracy theories, Joe Louis's resurgence was rewarded with a shot at the World Heavyweight Championship on the 22nd of June, 1937, at Chicago's Comiskey Park Baseball Stadium. Inside Louis's camp, there was an air of inevitable triumph. For 3 years, Jack Blackburn had assumed that white promoters would never give Louis a title shot. He said, "You were born with 2 strikes against you." That was the way of the world, he thought. Black heavyweights were never given everything. After the Braddock-Lewis match was set, Blackburn became a new man. Until Louis fought for the title, he abstained from alcohol and devoted himself to preparing Louis for a date with destiny. He said, "All right, you son of a bitch, you made it to here, and I'm going to see you make it all the way. When I finish with you, you're going to be a fucking fighting machine." He worked on Louis's flaws, his defensive shortcomings, such as the repeated dropping of that left that Schmeling shrewdly exploited, along with sharpening his explosive attacking arsenal. Come fight night, Blackburn marvelled at his creation. "This is it. You come home a champ tonight." Well, that he did. After 8 clubbing rounds, BoxRec.com details Joe's ascent to the mountaintop. It reads, 1 minute into the first round, Braddock and Lewis started to exchange punches, and Braddock dropped Lewis with a right uppercut to the chin. Lewis got up quickly and went on to dominate the rest of the bout. Due to severe bleeding and a badly swollen face, Braddock's manager, Joe Gould, wanted to stop the bout between rounds 7 and 8, but Braddock convinced Gould to let him go on. In round 8, Lewis threw a left to the body and followed with a hard right to the chin that put Braddock down. While Braddock laid lifelessly on the canvas, the referee counted him out at 1 minute and 10 seconds of the round. Braddock later said, "When he hit me with that left-right combination, I could have stayed down on the canvas for 3 weeks." And with that, Joe Louis was now the world heavyweight champion, the first black fighter to hold the crown since the infamous Jack Johnson lost it to Jas Willard on a hot Havana afternoon in 1915. Whilst Joe was champion by status, he still failed to consider himself as such. The Schmeling debacle hung over him, and he felt the need to avenge the smear on his record before he could proudly display his achievement. In his post-fight interview, Lewis almost berated reporters, saying, "Don't nobody call me champ till I beat that Schmeling." Schmeling, too, was brooding over the issue. Naturally, he felt he deserved the shot against Braddock, for it had already been in the pipeline when Lewis had usurped the postponement. He wanted to fight Lewis for the title now. Certainly, after his impressive victory, he wasn't worried about a return date with the new champion. Fate would surely match them quickly, he thought. A desire Lewis harboured, too, as a way to legitimise his reign. He was keen to fight the German in his first title defence as a result. Mike Jacobs would later explain that he tried in vain to make the match a reality, though he blamed Schmeling's greed for the failure to make the fight happen immediately. Instead, Lewis would fight Welshman Tommy Farr, another potential dance partner for Schmeling that was lured away from him by the lure of a Joe Louis fight. Schmeling had designs on a Farr fight as a warm-up for a Joe Louis return, though Mike Jacobs would again hijack Max's hopes by offering Farr a rugged miner from the Clydach Vale in Ronda, a $60,000 purse, along with 25% of any broadcasting rights monies that was paid for the fight. Jacobs could only sell 30,000 tickets for the contest at New York's Yankee Stadium, probably owing to Farr's lack of reputation across the Atlantic. Sports writers' musings would also limit the financial returns on the fight, as they readily told anyone within range that Farr would be knocked out. Although Lewis triumphed clearly, the fight was far from an easy affair for him. Farr would go the distance, presenting stubborn resistance to a heavy attack. He was not knocked down either. However, Lewis would still punish him, drawing blood from as early as the 3rd round and focusing on making a mess of the cuts throughout the showing. Referee Arthur Donovan would score the contest 13-1 with 1 round even, and the judges, Charlie Lynch and Billy McParland, would proverbially rubber stamp the unanimous decision for Lewis. A few days following Lewis's first sojourn as champion, Mike Jacobs imported some joyous news. The long-awaited Schmeling-Lewis second fight was on. The fight was announced for June of 1939, 9 months from the Farr bout. It was already September. Lewis couldn't train due to a hand injury sustained on the hard head of Tommy Farr, and Jacobs wasn't going to risk an autumn bout or rush into the fight. The schedule gave Lewis time to heal completely and undertake defences against less threatening opposition. Lewis would continue his reign with a second defence against Connecticut's Nathan Mann on the 23rd of February 1938, dispatching him in 3 rounds. Mann was subdued with 3 knockdowns before the ultimate finish, aptly dubbed manslaughter by the press. Bill Considine highlighted the Brown Bombers' vicious return to form in his article outlining the bout. He wrote, "All of the merciless cruelty that brought him to the top of the fight game came back to the fists and the heart of Joe Louis on Wednesday night when he knocked out the young Connecticut heavyweight after 1 minute and 56 seconds of the 3rd round. Once again, the merciless stalker Louis, leaner and meaner than the night he destroyed Primo Carnera, floored his game foe 4 times before man, giddy and gory from punches, was counted out by referee Arthur Donovan. The Negro has regained the old fire that was sadly lacking when Max pinned his ears back 2 summers ago. Lewis's final assignment prior to his meeting with his nemesis occurred on the 1st of April 1938, and unlike the significance of the day, Lewis was no fool when he mercilessly crushed Harry Thomas with a barrage in the 5th round. Thomas, an opponent shared by Lewis and Schmeling, was quick to nail his colours to the Joe Louis mast, saying after the fight, "Joe Louis will knock out Max Schmeling when they meet again. I am willing to bet every penny that I got in my purse last night that Joe Louis will knock out Max Schmeling." The fight for redemption had received the best build-up. Much like the previous battle between the two men, the narrative for Louis Schmeling too was centred around the morally objectionable social landscape of Nazi Germany, with Joe Louis representing America's stance on fascism as a paragon of virtue against Schmeling's embodiment of an evil regime that must be halted in its tracks. Ron Borges of the Ring magazine opined on the unfair characterisation of Schmeling in a 2023 article for RingTV.com. He said, "Schmeling was no Nazi. He never joined the Nazi Party, and in fact, he would secretly hide 2 young Jewish teenagers in his home 5 months later during the Kristallnacht, the night where brown-shirted Nazis destroyed Jewish homes, synagogues and businesses throughout the country, signalling the end of any semblance of normal Jewish life in Germany. Those actions came to symbolise the destruction of Jewish existence in Germany and put at risk Germans like Schmeling, who had agreed to hide away the teenage sons of 2 Jewish friends, very likely saving their lives while putting his own at risk. Only years later, that would give the world a different view of him that existed on June 22nd, 1938, the night that turned Joe Louis from a boxer into an American icon. Now, for a comprehensive breakdown of both the storyline of this fight and the ultimate showdown that became Joe Louis's redemption night, you can actually listen to our Legendary Nights episode dated the 18th of August 2021 with myself and Johnston tailing these 2 epic encounters. In summary, Joe Louis absolutely destroyed Max Schmeling in the rematch, and now that the Brown Bombers' mission was complete, following that trouncing of his former conqueror, he could finally revel in his status as champion without the imposter syndrome that crippled his psyche whilst the German equation had remained unsolved. After some hard-earned relaxation befitting a champion, Louis refocused and began training for his next defence, a 25th of January 1939 matchup at Madison Square Garden against John Henry Lewis. Lewis reigned as the light heavyweight champion of the world from 1935 to 1939 and was, like Lewis, an African-American. He was managed by Gus Greenlee, who was known to the local police department in Pittsburgh for his discrepancies surrounding gambling, a frowned-upon vice. Conversely, he was held in higher esteem by black sports fans for his long-time commitment to Negro Leagues baseball. Greenlee owned the Pittsburgh Crawfords and the popular Crawford Grill in Pittsburgh. He enhanced his reputation positively by giving scholarship money to young black teenagers so they could pay for their university education. Lewis displayed little enthusiasm in fighting Lewis, complaining to his management team, "I don't want to fight John Henry. He's my best friend. What's Uncle Mike up to that he wants me to toss punches at my pal?" Lewis would finally concede the matter on the grounds that it would present a sizable payday for his friend, although Lewis was afforded little chance of achieving a win. Such a forecast proved correct when the marauding Brown Bomber ended the fight in the first round in a showing that appeared to have been manufactured by Joe to ensure that John Henry wouldn't suffer, even though the display saw John Henry being knocked through the ropes. The lopsided fight prompted the sports writers to question Lewis as to why he did so much damage to a friend. Lewis replied that he didn't, that by wiping John Henry out in a single round, it prevented him from taking a beating for 15 rounds. And in Joe Lewis's word, he said, "So, you see, I was kind to him." Lewis's next victim was 36-year-old Jack Roper. This was Joe Lewis's 6th title defence, and it took place on the 17th of April 1939, with no spark coming from the challenger. An electrician by trade, as he was shocked by a vault of a left hand into submission after a mere 140 seconds of round one. It had been nearly 2 years since Louis won the heavyweight title, chalking up 6 defences in the process. His ledger stood at 38-1, and he was still only 24. Joe looked set for a long period, sat astride the throne. By smashing the menacing figure of Max Schmeling and by embarking on an active campaign of defences, Louis remained a household name. If at one time a heavily muscled black man with fists of thunder would have seemed intimidating to white America, Louis was now a fixture in their collective consciousness. Boxing became synonymous with the Brown Bomber. He was pound for pound before the inception of the term. He was the best, and everyone knew it. That status made Louis an almost ethereal force to African Americans who for once would have a symbol of their equality, perhaps even superiority in some eyes, over the whites. Louis embodied strength, courage and power, and owing to his management team, presented as the complete antithesis to the controversial Jack Johnson, the man that could be universally loved without anybody, white, black or rainbow-coloured, having to fear social reprisal. When he won the title in 1937, Louis had promised to be a fighting champion. No boxer had ever been more faithful to a pledge. He defended his title 3 times in 1938, 4 times in 1939, and another 4 times in 1940. Reporters began to refer to each opponent as the bum of the month in a collective club. But they were never. They were the best fighters in the heavyweight division. It was just that the gap between them and Joe was too wide to bridge. And in only a few of the matches, the 1939 fights against the marauding rotund Tony Gelento and the popular Bob Pastor, and the fights against Arturo Godov, was the interest of the general public aroused. But never during his championship years was Joe more often in the ring doing the same old thing than in 1941. It was the 3rd year of the Bum of the Month Club. At the end of January, Louis knocked out Red Berman. In mid-February, he made short work of Gus D'Orazio. In March, he took a bit more time to dispatch of Abe Simon, and in early April, he finished off Tony Musto. In May, he defeated Buddy Bayer on a disqualification. January, February, March, April, May. The popular saying in African-American neighbourhoods was that black school children learnt the months by following Joe Louis's career. Such was the frequency of his schedule and his visibility in American life. Such a schedule was imperative in helping the champ fill his royal treasury, building a bank account befitting a king. Louis's purses reflected his gargantuan achievements: $240,000 for the Max Bayer fight, $140,000 for the first Max Schmeling contest, $349,000 for the Schmeling rematch. To put this into perspective, the purse for Schmeling in 1938 equates to around $7.6 million today. Louis certainly utilised every cent, and by 1941, Louis was spending them like it was illegal to save them, in what would be a prophetic prelude to his later money troubles. It was not so much that the more he had, the more he spent. For him, the more he made, the more he overspent. Since he had begun to make serious money in late 1935, his circle, or more aptly, his circus of friends, associates and general hangers-on and glad-handers had grown exponentially. It was not unusual for Louis to begin a day with $400 or $500 in his wallet and run short of cash by noon. He treated often, tipped heavily, and gave the rest away. He was a target for every sob story and hard-luck tale that could be told. He lost far bigger sums through careless spending and poor investing. He was the embodiment of the American dream, a Rocky story before the days of Chuck Wepner, and he lived his life Hollywood style. He dressed the part. Clothes for Louis may not have been the sum of the man, but they were an important part of the equation. He had wardrobes bursting full of suits, shirts, racks of ties, shoes, drawers of underwear, socks and other unnecessary trinkets. It was not uncommon for Louis to change clothes 2 or 3 times a day. Ostentation was rife. The clothes fit for a king needed an adequate castle for storage too. In August 1939, Louis paid $100,000 for Spring Hill Farm in Utica, Michigan. Built in the 1830s and a stop on the Underground Railroad, Spring Hill Farm was a rolling 477-acre estate. Louis converted it into a riding academy and stable, including a white frame lodge, restaurant, dance hall and show ring. Spring Hill Farm became a show home for Louis, a symbol of his outward wealth and popular attraction for visitors from Detroit, Chicago and other parts of the Midwest who were looking to experience a slice of the high life. The Haven would lose Joe more money than he made. His Midas touch certainly did not extend from his fists to his finances or even his marriage. The trappings of success were tempting for Louis, and such success would place heavy demands on Joe's time. Louis's attention was always sought after, and his wife Marva understood most of the claims on her husband's time. She accepted that he had to spend months every year in training camps, travel widely for special appearances, disappear now and then to Hollywood for a part in film, and generally make himself available for a wide range of unspecified activities. But one of the unspecified activities that she found understandably difficult to accept was his habit of entertaining a harem-like collection of female admirers. Joe certainly had an eye for the ladies, and though he loved his wife, that eye would stray without restraint. Vernon E. Jordan Jr., the former president of the National Urban League, provided a glimpse of how women regarded Louis. When Jordan was a college student in Atlanta, he became friends with a waitress named Elsie, an older, experienced woman whom his mother would have called a hussy, but whom he considered very sexy. He once asked her, "You've had a lot of boyfriends. Who's the most exciting man you ever met?" She answered without hesitation, "Joe Louis." It was not so much the answer that impressed Jordan, it was the way she said Joe Louis. The body language was there, and she could generate body language. Away from the cameras, the glamour of being the wife of the heavyweight champion had faded for Marva Louis after 3 or 4 years. Joe freely gave away money and jewellery. Possessions didn't seem to impress him, though he was adorned with them. Joe, however, was possessive of Marva. He said, "All you have to do is be beautiful, gracious, a good mother and a good wife. Just be my doll baby." When he was training for a fight, or off on the road, he insisted that she wait at home for him, whilst he freely indulged in his philandering ways. When she travelled with him, Joe told Marva what to wear and how to behave. He even expected that she would associate only with her family and the wives of his friends. "Eventually, you tire of it," Marva recalled of her life with Joe. She said, "The crowds knocking your hat off and pushing you out the way to reach him. Fame is the most difficult thing that can happen to a relationship. Your life is just not your own. You always have to be up on the scene." And Joe was very proud. "Oh, Marva, you're not going to wear that. Change your clothes. You see, you represent them, and they want you to be tops. At least Joe did." Like Joe, Marva was forced to live a double life. Publicly, both had become important symbols of African American achievement, progress and dignity. More than any other black couple, they represented the American dream and validated the American success ethic. Privately, they lived a very different life. Joe enjoyed himself, disappearing when he chose, seeking the arms of other women and the comforts of welcoming black communities. Marva stayed in her perfectly furnished home, which was filled with dream possessions. Increasingly, she was wealthy and comfortable, though, like with Joe, possession grew to mean little when she became very lonely. Saddled with an unfettered growth of pain, Marva would ask Joe for a divorce shortly before what some believe would be Louis's toughest fight. Perhaps marital strife contributed to this. That fight occurred on the 18th of June, 1941, at New York City's Polo Grounds. The fighter was Billy Conn. Now, if you want to hear more about Joe Louis versus Billy Conn, please do go and listen to our recent Legendary Nights episode on this epic tale. Now, the Pittsburgh kid, Billy Conn, was 23 when he agreed to meet Louis in the ring. Louis was 27 and had gained an aura of invincibility since seizing the crown from Jim Braddock and demolishing Max Schmeling in a round. Then he had strengthened this reputation by fighting often and eliminating all other pretenders to the throne. Every heavyweight was gunning for him, but he was tough enough, resourceful enough and good enough to fend off all challengers. While Con stood at 6'3", the same as Louis, he was naturally a smaller man. His reach was shorter, his chest smaller, his biceps smaller, and his weight, no matter how much he ate, was not going to grow much beyond that light heavyweight limit. He was passionately followed by America's considerable Irish immigrant community. He was one of their own, and he represented the old country which their parents had left behind to come to the US. They swelled with pride when Con won the World Light Heavyweight Championship from Melino Bettina in 1939, and a win over Louis would see that pride explode. Con reeled off 9 wins in a row following his championship win before signing to face Louis, a fight that was touted by all for a while. Con had been a middleweight at the 160-pound level and excelled at 175. Did he really have the body of a heavyweight? Despite the obvious disparity in size between the two men, Con showed little trepidation about the fight. More than a year before he agreed to meet Louis, he made a confident prediction about how he might fare against him. Con said that some fighter was going to come along and make $1 million beating Joe Louis, and he may well be that fighter. Sports writer Jack Miley, the man who dubbed Louis tour of the heavyweight division the Bomb of the Month Club, publicised his belief in his view in 1939, 2 years before the Louis-Con bout. He was so impressed with Con's skills that he felt he would become the heavyweight champion one day against none other than Joe Louis by writing, "By 1941, Louis will be even more jaded from fighting all the bums, and Con will astound with his fearlessness, his speed. Hi-ho, it's written in the cards, mates." As the fight date of 18th of June 1941 approached, Louis admitted feeling discomfort about the size difference between the two men. He wanted to fight a man who looked and weighed in as a heavyweight. He had visions of weighing in at 202 pounds with Conor 172 or less, which he felt gave him a massive advantage, saying, "This would make me feel like I was a bully, taking advantage of a smaller man." Louis was frequently asked if he would be able to catch the smaller man and undertake the four-toed bullying. Louis coined one of the most famous lines in boxing history, and indeed all of sports history, in response to the viewpoint when he said, "He can run, but he can't hide." The utterance was an example of Louis's more polished articulation, a phrase that everyone remembered and repeated. More than 80 years later, it is still used in almost cliched fashion, with many replicating the phrase, though Louis was the primary source. The official weights for the bout at the Polo Grounds were 199 for Louis and 174 pounds for Con. It is often said in boxing and other sports that a good big man will overpower a good little man, but nothing is definite until the fighting is done. Louis was a 3-1 favourite, reflecting the view of the time that although he was smaller in stature, Con presented a more substantial challenge to Louis than many of his other recent defences against those Bum of the Month club. Con's Irish following lent their support in droves. They showed up in force and were loud, surely bolstering Con's morale leading into the mammoth encounter. Con had the better of the fight for 12 rounds, although it wasn't simply one-way traffic, with Louis uncorking a left to stun Con in the 5th, cutting his eye and nose. By the 8th round, Louis began suffering from dehydration, causing the quicker Con to initiate pulling away from Joe. By the 12th round, Louis was exhausted, with Con ahead on 2 of 3 boxing scorecards. His corner implored Con to avoid any real conflict, though Con continued to closely engage Louis in the later stages of the fight. Louis made the most of the opportunity, knocking Con out with 2 seconds left in the 13th round. Again, a more detailed synopsis of the fight is covered in our Louis vs. Con Legendary Nights episode dated the 29th of January 2024. The Con fight would not actually reoccur for some time. Plans were afoot for a 1942 return match, a reward for Con and his efforts. However, the United States of America would be called to World War II after the Pearl Harbor attacks by Japan in December 1941, shortly after another crushing victory against California's Lou Nova. Joe Louis represented the right man in the right role for these times. He was a patriotic believer that the United States was the best country in the world, even though he was very conscious of its flaws, especially in relation to its racist stance towards his fellow black citizens. After finishing off Nova and with a con rematch postponed, the next time Louis defended the crown against Buddy Bayer, he was not only fighting for himself, but he had also become a figurehead for the American war effort, literally fighting for the country. He enhanced his social standing when he fought Bayer, announcing that he was going to donate his entire purse to the US Naval Relief Society, essentially defending his heavyweight title for no monetary gain. This apparently selfless act won Louis a legion of new fans as well as more media allies. Jimmy Powers, a writer for the New York Daily News, wrote of this gesture, "The more I think of it, the greater guy I see in this Joe Louis." A few days after the Bayer bout, John Roxburgh, Julian Black and Mike Jacobs made a public show of donating $89,000 from their earnings to the Navy Relief Society. Not only was this unique amongst heavyweight champs, it was a remarkable decision on Louis's part for two other reasons. The first being that the Navy was known for its discrimination against blacks. Secondly, Louis was by now in heavy debt and needed every dollar he could get. He owed at least $81,000 to the US government in unpaid taxes and probably even more to Mike Jacobs, who was lending the free-spending champion money against his future earnings, perpetually placing Louis's financial status in the proverbial red. In between his KO of Bayer and the delivery of the donation to Navy Relief, Louis enlisted at Camp Upton on Long Island, New York. His arrival was heavily covered by the press, and he was officially going from making six figures per fight to a very humble Army private salary of $21 a month. Although Louis showing up for induction into the Army was big news, there was nothing much out of the ordinary about his sign-up and processing, and that precisely was the point. Louis joined up to be treated the same as everyone else. Thinking like that was pretty much unrealistic. However, because he was one of the most famous men in America and the most famous black man in the country, despite his desire to be an everyman, Louis was offered the chance to become an officer, but refused the invitation, choosing to enter the Army as an enlisted man. It was consistent with his character and true to his nature. He didn't want to take on a responsibility he didn't feel qualified for, just because of his celebrity status. He became a morale officer, and in the coming years would be deployed throughout the world to visit with troops at different fronts to raise their moods. It was a wise use of Louis's talents. Just how the Army was going to use Louis was not yet set in cement when he was training for Bayer, but he did make an appearance at a Navy Relief fundraising dinner. Before the event, a friend urged Louis to write a makeshift speech in case he was called upon to speak. Louis naively said no one was going to ask him to talk. He was wrong. Louis was asked to say a few words. He uttered only a few improvised lines, though, like many a Louis soundbite, they proved to be memorable. The United States, Louis said, was going to win the war. "We can't lose, because we're on God's side," he said. The friend initially told Louis he got it backwards, that he should have said, "We can't lose because God's on our side." The guy teased Louis, saying he was a dummy. However, Louis's turn of phrase inspired thought. It made people think, made people believe that America was indeed God's own country. The comment got widespread attention to such an extent that some reporters said Louis had named the war. Who's the dummy now? Louis would later riposte. His unscripted statement also stimulated thought among the upper echelons of the Army hierarchy. Joe Louis had an international reputation. He was admired by millions, wielding unparalleled influence. The Army decided that Louis could best serve his country not by fighting on the front lines, but as someone who could boost morale on the home front and those on the front lines by becoming the face of a propaganda campaign. The Army would produce posters that featured a picture of Joe wearing a helmet and brandishing a bayonet. The poster would also emblazoned with the words, "Private Joe Louis says we're going to do our part, and we'll win because we're on God's side." Whilst the political and military battles raged on, Louis still found time to box, meeting Abe Simon. He had already beaten Simon once in 1941 in Detroit, but this bout was also for a worthy cause. When Louis stopped Simon in 6 rounds, he donated $64,000 to the Army Emergency Relief Fund. Although Louis was willing to continue training and fighting as the heavyweight champion, with plans afoot for the Billy Conn rematch, the Army would prohibit further matches following the Simon fight. With Louis's record standing at 53-1, his boxing career was forcibly stopped and the heavyweight title was rendered dormant as well. It was deemed that Louis was more valuable for the war effort in other ways than simply knocking out a slew of overmatched challengers. While attitudes were changing in the United States towards blacks at the outbreak of World War II, the armed forces were still segregated, and in high places there was a concern that issues might arise. The Army appointed Truman Gibson, a friend and attorney for Louis, at various times in their lives inside the War Department as a Washington, D.C.-based liaison to the blacks in the service. Gibson was Louis's go-to man whenever issues arose concerning Joe's tenure in the forces. He was a fixer of sorts, tasked with resolving discrimination issues. Several situations arose that demonstrated Gibson's influence. Once scheduled to fight an exhibition for a group of soldiers, Louis realised that all of the best seats were going to the white men and that the black soldiers weren't allowed to watch. He refused to go on unless that situation was remedied. While stationed at Fort Riley in Kansas, Louis became aware that many seemingly qualified African American soldiers were being denied the chance to attend officer candidate school. One of them was Jackie Robinson, later the man who broke baseball's colour barrier with the Brooklyn Dodgers. Louis reported the situation to Gibson, and those men were accepted into the program. That was not the only time Louis assisted Robinson, and their friendship grew. On another occasion, Louis informed Gibson that this United States outpost not only had separate buses for black and white soldiers on the base, but even separate bus stations. Word got back to Fort Riley. That was a no-no. At another base in Alabama, Louis, who was with Sugar Ray Robinson, the future middleweight champion of the world, sat down on a whites-only bench. Robinson met Louis for the first time some years before, when Louis was fighting in Detroit. He ingratiated himself with the older man by carrying his bag around. But this time, they became ensnared in a conflict with military policemen over the seating. Once again, it took a phone call to Washington to smooth things over. Sailors called Louis a nigger, and an officer in his presence derided a black Jeep driver for being late by summing up that all niggers were perpetually late. Louis got the officer removed from his assignment. On a startling occasion, MPs arrested Louis for making a phone call from a white-only payphone. When the situation could be handled without Gibson's intervention, Louis took control on his own by complaining to the base's commanding officer. Anything beyond the reach of this would be dealt with by Gibson. Yes, Louis's country needed him in the service as a morale builder, but everywhere he went, it seemed his people, black Americans, needed him even more. What was most impressive was how he continuously rose to the occasion. He was no longer the shy teenager from Alabama and Detroit starting out in the world. He was a mature man, one of the most distinguished sporting figures anywhere. He had become more assertive in places outside of the boxing ring. Louis had reached an exalted place in American society. He was a black man who could speak for blacks when he chose to, and he was a black man who could speak for the country when necessary. He had not single-handedly cured discrimination, but perhaps it could be said that he narrowed chasms of misunderstandings into more manageable ditch-width misunderstandings. It took broad enough shoulders to accomplish even that. Much later, Joe Louis Barrow Jr., Louis's son, who mostly grew up with his mother Martha and was not a fan of boxing, actually wrote a book about his father, exploring his role in the civil rights movement during his time in the army and beyond. Barrow confirmed that his father probably called Gibson once a week with complaints during his military residence. And after the war years, and in his own later years, Louis did not depart from character and turn into an engaging speaker on the subject like Muhammad Ali would be later on, though he continued to deal with discrimination when he confronted it. Louis was well aware that many blacks thought he didn't do all he could for the civil rights movement. But he also knew his limitations. Some folks shout, some holler, some march and some don't, he explained, without animosity towards those who belittled him. He said, They do it their way, I do it mine. I got nothing to be ashamed of. I stand for right and work for it hard because I know what it means to not have the rights what God give us. By the time Joe Louis had left the segregated ranks of the army, he was a 30-year-old champion of the world who had not fought in more than 2.5 years, with his benefit showing against Abe Simon in March 1942. Despite the prolonged rest from fistic pursuits, perhaps seemingly benefiting the champ, life would not be as its optimum when Joe would make his highly anticipated return to the sport. Louis's trainer, Jack Chappie Blackburn, would not be in his corner, as he had not been for the Simon fight either, due to continually degrading health. Blackburn was hospitalised in Chicago that same year, suffering from pneumonia, and Louis visited him before returning to Fort Dix in New Jersey. Almost as soon as he returned to duty, however, Louis received a telegram from friend Freddie Grignard that would turn his world upside down. "Chappie's dead," he proclaimed. Blackburn had recovered sufficiently to be released, but soon after going home, he suffered a heart attack and passed away on the 24th of April 1942, less than a month after Louis's bout with Simon. When Louis received the news of Blackburn's death, he sobbed uncontrollably. The funeral took place in Chicago, and after the army granted him 2 weeks' leave, Louis would carry his mentor's coffin as a large crowd of around 10,000 people looked on. Chappie was buried at Lincoln Cemetery, and when the dirt went down on that coffin, I knew my life would never be the same again, recalled Louis. Louis's career would commence with assistant trainer Manny Seaman at the helm, a move that may have helped steady the ship somewhat when Louis decided to put on the gloves once again. The return match with Billy Conn was the first order of fighting business for Joe Louis. The two men signed to me on the 19th of June 1946. 5 years had passed since the thrilling and surprising encounter in the first meeting between the two men. Like Louis, Conn went into the army when the Second World War began, and he, also, just like Louis, was paid $21 a month as a private instead of taking home a 6-figure payday from a rematch. In a further echo to Joe Louis's army career, Conn enlisted to fight exhibitions and entertain soldiers away from combat, and he and Louis saw each other in London during the war because of this assignment. But when he was a civilian once again, there was no doubt that Conn had designs on a Louis rematch. This was announced for Yankee Stadium in June, 6 months after the public unveiling of the idea. Plenty of time for a build-up for promoter Mike Jacobs, and plenty of time for the two principals to round into form for their big test. Ringside seats were $100. Conn's preliminary training camp was set up in Hot Springs, Arkansas, supposedly at the order of mobster Oni Madden, who apparently wanted the entertainment where he was hanging out. Those 3 years in the army didn't help my ring condition any, Conn said, excusing his wartime exhibitions. Conn was 28 and Louis was 32. Flat, muscled bellies were harder to come by, but both men looked fighting fit at the weigh-in. Conn weighed in at 182 pounds and Louis 207. There was still a 25-pound disparity. At one point when Conn and Louis ran into each other after the first fight, Conn said, "I had your ass beat. I could have won the title, been the champion 6 months, then I'd let you win it back." Louis, as he always seemed to manage to do, when he came back with a summarisation of the situation, he said, "How were you going to keep the title for 6 months when you couldn't keep it for 12 rounds? Though not as famous as the first encounter between the two men, Louis Conn too made history as being the first televised heavyweight title fight. The match is described by Rhiannon Walker in a 2017 article for Anscape.com. It reads, "It took 5 fewer rounds and just 3 dynamite punches from Louis to wrap up the rematch." According to the Daily Tribune, the first blow was a powerful shot to the right side of Conn's head, which resulted in Conn's knees buckling. The second came after Conn folded toward the mat. Before he fell completely, Louis hit him with a punishing left hook, and in the blink of an eye completed the task with a swift right to send the overmatched fighter to the floor. Conn rolled over in concession, and referee Eddie Joseph did a 10 count to officially end the match. Louis had already signalled the end of the fight by turning and walking away from the outstretched man, knowing his blows were decisive. Wilfred Smith of the Chicago Tribune heaped praise on Joe Louis for the win. He wrote, "Tonight, Louis settled for all time this question of puncher and the boxer. Louis outboxed Con. Then he ended the one-sided fight with all the sudden fury with which he had crushed Max Schmeling of Germany in 1938. Con is a great lightweight. He once held the title, but tonight it was all too clear he was a boy on a man's errand." The fight earned a gate of $1.9 million, which was the second largest amount in boxing's history, behind the $2.6 million the 1927 Jack Dempsey-Gene Tunney Championship fight in Chicago. The Brown Bomber was back. Momentum was slow, however, with the number of challengers to Louis's throne limited at the end of the war. Bronx native Tammy Moriello was the last fight of 1946 that September for Louis, who put up notable resistance, driving Louis to the ropes with a smashing right to the jaw early in the first round, though ultimately succumbing to the champion in the very same stanza. The next competitive clash for Louis wouldn't take place until the 5th of December 1947. The opponent, a wily slickster going by the name of Jersey Joe Walcott. Walcott, who was born Arnold Cream, was as hungry as the next man for a shot at the heavyweight crown. Like so many other boxers, he had chosen the profession as a way out of poverty. Born in 1914 in Pensacola, New Jersey, Walcott, one of 12 children, was about the same age as Louis. At times when he was young, his family did not have enough food, so meals had to be skipped. Nothing would come easy to Walcott. He quit school to work when he was 15 after his father died. When Walcott began fighting, it was decided that Arnold Cream didn't sound like a rough-and-tumble boxer, so Walcott took the name of a prior welterweight champion, Barbados Joe Walcott, who ruled his division, being its first ever black champion between 1901 and 1906. Interestingly, Jersey Joe's early trainer was also Jack Blackburn, the same man who masterminded the physical ascent of Joe Louis to the crown. Walcott eventually lost contact with Blackburn, who had been hired to take care of Louis, but in 1936, 2 years after the two men last met, Blackburn offered him a job as a Louis sparring partner when Louis was preparing for the first bout with Max Schmeling. Walcott was compensated $25 a round, with at least one round guaranteed on every day that Louis remained in training. Walcott's services as a sparring partner were not retained for long. He claimed he knocked Louis down in sparring and was dismissed immediately afterwards. Contradicting accounts say that Louis knocked Walcott down, causing him to quit of his own accord, whereas a biography of Walcott says that he told a grandson that he knocked Louis down 2 days running and then was told to leave the camp. Whatever the truth, it would be more than 10 years before Louis and Walcott signed for the first of their two actual fights, an opportunity to play out the perpetrated scenarios. Louis was the most industrious heavyweight champion in history. Typically, he fought every few months, but after he chilled out the division with his domination of Con and Moriello, he departed from his predictable schedule. Louis took the title on the road, fighting exhibitions everywhere from Hawaii to Mexico throughout Central and South America. His normal fee was $10,000 per appearance, and he cleared more than $150,000 from his travels. A significant sum, but it was not enough for Louis's needs. He was under a lot of financial strain due to his large entourage, for whom he paid every expense footing the bill, as well as being constantly harangued by the Internal Revenue Service, who insisted on taking a large percent of every fight purse from Louis in pursuit of taxes. Circumstances meant that Louis had to fight on and stay active despite his now dulling skills. He had not lost since 1936, though an examination by a doctor in the run-up to his fight with Walcott revealed a notable deterioration in the reflexes of the heavyweight champion. Though retirement at this juncture would have been advisable, Louis did not feel he was in the stable financial position he needed to be in to give up boxing. Louis weighed in at 211 pounds to Walcott's 194 on fight night. Lou Friedman described the contest a visible example of Joe Louis's advancing decline. It reads, "From the opening bell, Walcott was the superior aggressor. He boxed and moved, he punched and connected. Walcott's style flummoxed Louis. Before the first round ended, Walcott dropped Louis to the floor with a well-timed right-hand blow to the head. Louis was up at the count of 2, seemingly determined to prove that Walcott's success was a fluke. Louis seemed tangled in his own limbs as he frustratingly couldn't unwind and clip Walcott with his heavy artillery. He scored, but not consistently. Then in the 4th round, Walcott scored a second knockdown. The garden was buzzing, astonished at the way Walcott seemed in command. By the 5th round, Louis was also dripping blood from his nose. As the rounds played out, Louis' exchanges grew sharper and Walcott employed a strategy of staying outside more. Walcott frequently backed up, but after a while, Louis refused to come to him and waited for the challenger. Their exchanges evened out, and Louis belted Walcott's body. Walcott pummeled Louis' face, causing swelling. When the bell ended after 15 rounds, Louis appeared dispirited, in no way resembling the recently overwhelming champion. He attempted to leave the ring before the announcement had been made, but his seconds grabbed him, informing Joe he would be disqualified if he did so. One eye shut, cheeks swollen, Louis looked beaten. However, when the official scores were read, he prevailed. 2 judges voted for Louis, while Goldstein backed Walcott on his scorecard. Goldstein raised Louis' hand and proclaimed that he was still heavyweight champion of the world. But the New York fans, usually so kind to Louis, booed the split decision. Louis himself was scathing in his assessment of the performance, saying later, "I won, but I was disgusted with myself. It was a bad fight. I always said I wasn't the man I was before." Walcott echoed the sentiment, feeling disheartened by the controversial decision. "I thought I won 9 rounds." Public opinion was on Walcott's side after the disputed result, with a rematch being ordered for June 25, 1948. Louis made the announcement in the run-up to the fight that regardless of the result, he would retire thereafter. He said, "After that, the next fight I have will be in a barroom. I've had enough. I've been around a long time." He had indeed, residing with the heavyweight title since June 22, 1937, making 24 successful defences of it, an unprecedented statistic. The rematch with Walcott was a fitting swan song for Louis. He would right the perceived wrongs of the first fight, knocking Walcott out with 1 right hand followed by 3 lefts, ending matters at 2 minutes 56 seconds of the 11th round. Louis was now a retired fighter, though this would not remain the status quo for long due to the financial strain that Louis had been placed under by the IRS. Louis would try to counteract the loss of his considerable regular income as heavyweight champion by utilising his magnificent sporting reputation. Louis would be employed by the 20th Century Sporting Club for $25,000 a year, an amount that he looked at as a pension of sorts. Then, with the influence of his contact in Washington, Truman Gibson, Louis made a deal with the newly formed International Boxing Club to arrange a heavyweight elimination tournament to crown a new champion. Despite these income streams, Louis's considerable debt would not subside. An audit showed he owed more money in taxes than previously calculated due to the poor financial advice he had received during his time at the top. Louis was told by the IRS that the total amount of debt stood at $500,000. The only way Louis could ever hope to neutralise this burden was to don the gloves and again fight. Before the end of 1949, in November, Louis returned to the ring in an exhibition bout against Johnny Shakur. Then in September of 1950, Louis made his official comeback. The fighter who emerged as the new heavyweight champ following Louis's retirement was the Cincinnati Cobra, Ezzard Charles. Charles, a small heavyweight who fought at 190 pounds, won the title by beating Joe Walcott in a 15-round fight. Charles was a small man compared to Louis. He didn't have the ex-champ's punching power, and to some he was viewed as a guardian of Louis's title rather than the real champ. When Louis announced he was coming out of retirement, Charles welcomed the chance to add legitimacy to his crown by unseating the figure he considered his idol. The presiding school of thought, however, was that Louis could emerge from 2 years of inactivity and win back the crown. Those 2 years had been unkind to Louis's physique. The man who would usually enter the ring at a trim 202 pounds or thereabouts, grossly exceeding that for the Charles meeting, weighing at 218 pounds. This was a sign that Louis had had trouble dropping the weight in training, perhaps a negative sign of his advancing years. It was bound to slow him down as a fighter who was already on the wane pre-retirement, let alone now. Charles was younger, faster, and more accurate with his shots. Louis didn't ever seem to hurt him in the bout, and he ran the second-time challenger to sheer exhaustion, winning the vast majority of the 15 rounds on his way to a decision victory. Charles had cemented his reign with a classic old lion, young lion usurpation. Now, after his second loss, fans urged him to retire and stay so. He felt it necessary too that way, but Uncle Sam and the IRS persisted with their tax demands, rendering it an impossibility. Immediately trying to rebuild his reputation for another shot at the title, Louis took on opponents that were not as highly thought of as a Charles or a Walcott, but would keep him in decent fettle. To stay fit, to reduce his debt and to reduce the sting of defeat, Louis fought and beat Cesar Brayon, Freddie Bashaw, Emilio Agramonte, Andy Walker, Agramonte again, Lee Savold, the British heavyweight champ, Brayon again, and Jimmy Bivens. He racked up 8 wins in a row. With this, and his record now at 66 wins, opposing the losses to Charles and Schmeling. The logical step for Louis now was to launch another assault on his old title. Louis would have to step up in class once again to make this move. This time, a rock of a man with no real boxing style would be before Louis, a rugged up-and-comer by the name of Rocky Marciano, in what would prove to be the final assignment of a storied, illustrious boxing career. Marciano was not a cute boxing stylist, preferring to rely on sheer brute force to dispatch of opponents. When he was growing up and fostering a love of boxing, the man he most admired and appreciated was Joe Louis. Louis was the beacon to aspire to. The best and the Brockton blockbuster also craved that distinction. On October 26, 1951, Marciano, the young immovable force, met the aging veteran Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, in a scheduled 10-rounder at Madison Square Garden. It was a $300,000 payday for Louis, with a potential shot at the heavyweight title looming large in the background for the victor. Marciano was in his prime at 28, and Louis was 37, well past his prime and considered an old man. For bleeding and exhausted, Louis was halted in the 8th round of a scheduled 10-rounder. His career was over. Marciano, who cried due to the battering he unfurled onto his hero, would soon be champion himself, becoming the only heavyweight champion to retire undefeated. Louis was now the owner of a 66-3 slate. In the presence of Sugar Ray Robinson, Marciano would venture to Louis's dressing room after the fight to apologise emotionally. "What's the use of crying?" Joe replied. "The better man won. That's all." The end of Joe's boxing career initiated a fight just as tough, though this would be held in the arena of life instead of the confines of the ring. Joe's money woes were growing exponentially. Any time he made any money, the IRS would hound him for their share. They consumed savings accounts set aside for his kids, and it vicariously swallowed any earnings Joe received from boxing promotion. It was estimated that Louis made around $5 million. Once, later in life, a friend asked Louis if he didn't wish he had come along in later decades when boxers made much more than that for a single title defence. Louis summed up this curiosity perfectly when he said, "In my time, I made $5 million, wound up broke, and owed the government $1 million in taxes. If I was fighting today, I'd earn $10 million, would still wind up broke, and would owe the government $2 million in taxes." It was a sad self-assessment of Joe's discipline and poor receipt of financial advice. Louis's fans wondered how the government could treat a man who did so much for his country, including raising millions of dollars for the effort during World War II, so poorly. Alfred Saminsky, a Democratic representative from New Jersey, tried to aid the struggling hero by introducing a bill into Congress that would have required the IRS to forgive Louis's debt. It was not passed. The IRS did try to compromise, however, presenting Louis with a payment plan deal with the debt that would allow him a set amount of money to live on. Louis feared prior to this that he would be incarcerated for failing to pay, and had said out loud to friends, "You don't think they'd put me in jail, do you?" Whilst the pressure rose due to the ever-increasing demands placed on the Brown Bomber, his circle of familiar associates fell in number. Mike Jacobs, the man with the key who unlocked the heavyweight championship door for Joe, died in January 1953, following years of ailing health accelerated by him suffering a cerebral hemorrhage in 1946. Louis Barrow, Joe's strong as steel mother, passed away in December 1953, and his brother Lonnie, the eldest of the Barrow brood, would die in 1960. Louis would marry his second wife in 1955, a beautician called Rose Morgan. Rose would try her best to alleviate Joe's money troubles by managing his finances. She went as far as to enter the couple onto television game shows, a medium that a retired Louis had found a fondness for as a way to earn an extra crust. When they teamed up to take $60,000 in winnings on a show called High Finance, the IRS were waiting to pounce, with only half of the money being seized because the other half belonged to Morgan. Despite the best efforts of Rose to instill stability into Joe's life, Louis would continue his unfaithful approach to his wedding vows, engaging in extramarital affairs with other women. The couple would split up after 18 months of partnership. Joe would continue his pursuit of a happy marriage when he wed his third and final wife, Martha Jefferson, in 1959. Martha would exhibit a patience beyond the comprehension of many when Louis, again veering down the path of adultery, fathered a child with another woman. Jefferson would go on to adopt the child, raising it as her own. The swinging 60s would introduce the Brown Bomber to Las Vegas and yet another vice to accompany his unbridled spending and insatiable womanizing: cocaine. Charles Sonny Liston reigned atop the heavyweight tree in 1962. The Big Bad Bear, as he would be named by Cassius Clay later on, was a feared puncher with next to no amateur pedigree, learning to box in prison. Louis and Liston would become friends, with Joe inviting Sonny to live with them when he moved to Denver, Colorado. There were many unsavoury tales floating around about Liston during the height of Louis's friendship with him, with some believing that it was he who made the introduction of the devil's dandruff to Louis, though Joe would quash this claim. Already a heroin user, Louis would claim that drugs would make him feel better, particularly as an antidote to the pain caused by the death of a loved one. He would say that, "I kept telling myself that nothing could be wrong with feeling that good." In between the activities and addictions that befell him, Louis would tussle with a stint as a professional wrestler. Louis wasn't embarrassed by this visibly garish attempt at earning money, though some fans felt that it presented a sad fall from grace for him. Naturally, Louis, in tandem with his public image, played the archetypal babyface role, a good guy wrestler who had to put up with a certain mistreatments from villains, though, as was often the case in the boxing ring, he would eventually come out on top. The money would also take away any tinge of awkwardness. His pay was substantial. Louis signed a contract for $100,000 to wrestle on tour. He was unable to honour it, however, not because of any public outcry or his own concerns, but because he got injured only a couple of matches into his new career. At one match in Washington, D.C., Jersey Joe Walcott, also in need of money, was the referee. The match ended with Louis throwing his opponent, Cowboy Rocky, out of the ring. It was all for show, of course. Any real exertion of force from Louis would have caused serious injury to the cowboy. Now back to Sin City, Las Vegas. That would present the perfect arena to indulge all of Joe Louis's ill-advised passions. A place where money flowed freely, and no predilection, no matter how extreme, was frowned upon or judged. Ash Resnick was Joe's contact in Vegas. Resnick met Joe when they were both inducted into the Army in 1942 on Governor's Island. They had stayed in touch and visited each other on occasion. In 1960, Resnick was running the casino at the Thunderbird, one of the few places that allowed blacks in the main rooms. When Joe was coming into town, Resnick would give him a few $1,000s for gambling. It was no big deal. Louis, who always treated money like it was going out of fashion, could be counted on to lose every dollar back to the house, so ex-fighter and the generous casino owner would both be happy. When Resnick left the Thunderbird to take charge at Caesar's Palace, he gave Joe Louis a permanent job as a greeter. It was a good deal, $50,000 a year in salary, house money to gamble with, a nice place for Louis to live, all the golf he wanted, and whatever spending money he needed, every whim would be catered for. The money was a small expense to Resnick when compared to the money he made by having the former champion in residence. Joe was a hero, and people flocked to see him. Randy Roberts described his time at Caesars Palace when he wrote, "One time, a middle-aged female tourist saw him in the lobby at Caesars Palace, exclaiming, 'I know you. You're Don Newcombe. My grandson will be thrilled to have your autograph.' Not wanting to disappoint the woman, he took a pencil and autograph book, then turned to a friend and said quietly, 'How do you spell Don Newcombe?'" Billy Conn recalled another night when he was at Caesars with Louis talking about old times. He had a pocket full of black chips and a pocket full of green chips, Conn explained. A bum comes up to him, and he gave him a black chip, and I said, "Why don't you give him a green chip? A black chip's $100 and a green chip is $25. He said, "What the hell's the difference? I'm going to lose it anyway." Ash Resnick was right. What wasn't there to love about Joe Louis? Louis recalled his fondness for his tenure as a greeter later on in life. He said, "It feels good to walk through the casino and have people calling out, 'Hey, champ.' 'Hi there, champ. Come stand next to me for luck.'" Every upside must of course have its downside. In the late 1960s, after Louis began making appearances in Vegas, and as he was transitioning to a full-time life in Nevada, the former champ began displaying signs of mental deterioration that alarmed his closest family members. He showed signs of paranoia, claiming that people were after him. He unscrewed light bulbs in lamps in hotel rooms, believing that they contained surveillance equipment. He blocked air vents in those rooms so he couldn't be poisoned by the air. He even built forts in his room to provide him with a psychological haven before he slept. After a lengthy period of this worrying behaviour, Louis was taken for assessment at the Colorado Veterans Administration psychiatric ward, though it wasn't voluntarily. Joe Louis Jr. conspired with his stepmother Martha and signed the commitment papers. After a couple of months of enforced respite, Joe Louis was able to return to Las Vegas taking medication that would help balance his troubled mind. The fight business had come to him in Las Vegas, and that meant that Louis was in on the action. His friend Sonny Liston lost a heavyweight belt to Muhammad Ali, who by this point had changed his name from Cassius Clay and aligned with the Black Muslim movement. Unlike Louis, he was loud and brash, courting controversy wherever he went. Louis frowned upon Ali's actions, funny as many of them were, didn't give him the full credit for his boxing skills, naming several heavyweights of the past he felt could best Ali. When Ali exercised his right as a conscientious objector rather than going to the army as a soldier of the Vietnam War, it actually offended Louis. Louis had signed up quickly and worked hard for the American cause during World War II. Louis didn't see any difference between what historians labelled the Good War and the Vietnam War, which was the most vociferously opposed war in American history. There was eventually a reconciliation between the two men. Though they represented different eras in African-American fights for rights and in their chosen sport, both became beloved and respected. Whenever all-time rankings are made of boxing figures, it usually is either Louis or Ali that's ranked as the best heavyweight ever, though of course Louis believed he would have won if they fought in their primes, and naturally enough, Ali believed he would have won. There is no way, of course, of solving this conundrum of who was the best, though it makes for riveting conversation. In 1977, Louis's physical health began to fail, as he started to experience heart problems. By then, John Roxborough had died, passing away on the 13th of December 1975. Julian Black would also depart less than 6 months after this in 1976. Despite every influential figure in Joe Louis's career development having now gone, Louis still had people he could rely on owing to the years of positive relationships that he developed. For example, old Blue Eyes Frank Sinatra, for whom Louis once did a favour, footed the cost of Louis's medical needs. Dr. Michael E. DeBakey, the world-famous heart surgeon, operated on Louis. While the operation was deemed a success, a short while later, Louis suffered a stroke, leaving him confined to a wheelchair for mobility. The once graceful step of a sporting giant was no longer evident, and his speech was stunted to a whisper. though he could still summon his immeasurable strength to speak when he needed to. In an emotional appearance on UK television's This Is Your Life in 1978, Joe would surprise his friend Muhammad Ali, for whom the show was centred on, with words of support from his home saying, "Hello Muhammad, when you were a little boy, you used to watch me on television. Now I enjoy watching you on television. I'm sorry I can't be with you." It was powerful stuff, moving Ali to teary eyes. It also illustrated the power that the great Louis held, even at his low points. He was a hero to legends, and simple words from him could make those legends falter. Joe Louis would make his final public appearance on the 11th of April 1981, sitting ringside for the WBC heavyweight title fight between Larry Holmes and Trevor Berbick. Less than 24 hours later, after a heart attack, Joe Louis passed away. His funeral was much like the man's life, a momentous occasion, fit for a force of nature, as Joe was. 3,000 people gathered for the ceremony, and Frank Sinatra, in yet another gesture of his affection for Louis, footed the bill without any great publicity. He said this of the champ: "It's kinda nice to know that the man who never rested on canvas now sleeps on clouds." The Reverend Jesse Louis Jackson, born in 1941, a few months after the Louis-Con fight, and named for Jesse Owens and Joe Louis, delivered the eulogy. Standing at a podium in the middle of the ring, directly behind Louis's coffin, Jackson's voice cut through the sombre atmosphere. He said, "This is not a funeral. This is a celebration. We are honouring a giant who saved us in a troubled time. With Joe Louis, we had made it from the guttermost to the uttermost, from the slave ship to the championship. Usually, the champion rides out on the shoulders of the nation and its people, but in this case, the nation rode on the shoulders of the hero Joe." He continued the gushing appraisal, earning a standing ovation from the mourners. "We all feel bigger today because Joe came this way. He was in the slum, but the slum was not in him. Ghetto boy to man, Alabama sharecropper to champion. Let's give Joe Louis a big hand clap. This is a celebration. Let's hear it for the champ." So that concludes the tale of Joe Louis's career profile. And I think you'll have to agree that Jimmy Cannon said it best when he penned this immortal quote: "Joe Louis is a credit to his race, the human race." And there you go, ladies and gentlemen. That brings an end to the career profile of the legendary Joe Louis. One hell of an episode. Absolute pleasure to sit down and deliver this episode. I've learned so much about Joe Louis that I didn't already know. And it's great to be able to put that out there for you guys and be able to help educate people that don't know as much about Joe Louis as maybe what they do now. And it's fantastic that many of you wanted to request this episode, because it wasn't one that we'd put on the list for a while. Of course, it was a huge episode for us to do, and I'm really glad that I've been able to sit down and deliver this episode to you guys. Before I go any further, though, I must give massive credit to Jamie Albrecht, the co-host for the BTR Boxing Podcast Network, because he put some great words together for this episode and did some great research to help me deliver a fantastic episode on the career of Joe Louis. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do let us know. You can find us on social media at BTR Boxing Podcast Network on all social apps. If you're on X, you can find us at career_profiles on there. If you've not subscribed to this podcast, you can do so individually on Apple, on Spotify. If you're listening on YouTube, please click the subscribe button. If you are on any other available podcasting app out there, you can find this by typing in Career Profiles, or it will also be on the BTR Boxing Podcast Network feed. I also want to take a moment just to say thank you to the patrons of the podcast for subscribing to us through patreon.com. The support that you're providing to us through patreon.com is allowing us to get more resources to put these episodes together. And with there being a big transition on the network, with us looking to enhance some of the stuff that we're doing going forward, it's absolutely pivotal that you guys continue to support us. And if you're not a supporter through Patreon, this would be a perfect time to go and check us out, because we're giving this episode out earlier to the patrons than we are to everybody else. And we do that with all of our series-based content. All the content comes ad-free on there. We have got Patreon-only content, and going forward, myself and Jamie are looking to develop the Patreon page, adding more layers of different episodes, more interactive content, more video-based content as we continue to grow the podcast and the network as a whole. We're seeking to get the feedback from yourselves on Patreon, but also you guys in general listening. If you've got any thoughts and feelings on the show, on the network, on anything we can do to suffice your boxing needs going forward, please do let us know. We really appreciate the feedback. If you've been listening on Spotify, please leave a comment below on the episode. It's a great feature that they've introduced, and it really helps us when seeing what people are actually thinking about these episodes as well. So please, if you're listening on Spotify, leave a comment in the box below. Let others know what you think of it. Let us know what you think of it. It is truly appreciated, and we do get that level of feedback. But that is it for this episode. You've been listening to the career profile of Joe Louis on the BTR Boxing Podcast Network.